Sometimes a man's whole life can change with the turn of a single card. Jacob Stone never imagined that one winter night in a Montana saloon would lead him to a destiny he never knew he was searching for. He'd won an old hunting lodge from a stranger in a card game, a place nobody had set foot in for years. When he finally made the journey up the mountain and stepped through that creaking door, what he found inside took his breath away. There were old journals, hand-drawn maps, and a locked box containing secrets that someone had died protecting. The lodge wasn't just an empty building. It held the story of a man's entire life, and now dangerous men were coming to claim what they believed was theirs. What would Jacob do when he discovered the truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jacob Stone had been living in the Montana Territory for nearly 15 years, and in all that time he'd learned that the mountains didn't lie to you. They didn't make promises they couldn't keep, and they didn't ask questions about your past. That suited Jacob just fine. He'd come west after the war, after everything that mattered had been taken from him. His wife, Mary, had died, bringing their child into the world, a daughter who lived only 3 days before following her mother into the ground. Jacob had buried them both in Illinois, walked away from the small farm they'd built together, and never looked back. The army had trained him as a scout, taught him to read land and track movement, to survive on nothing and trust his instincts. Those skills kept him alive in the wilderness, but it was the silence of the high country that kept him sane. He'd built a small cabin near the Bitterroot Range, trapped fur in winter, hunted game for the mining camps in summer, and played cards when he needed supplies or human company. Jacob had a reputation in the territory: honest, fair, skilled with his hands and his rifle, and someone who kept his word. Men respected him. They also knew better than to pry into why a man who clearly had education and breeding chose to live alone in the mountains like a hermit. That December night in Bannock, Jacob had stopped at the Silver Bell Saloon for a hot meal and maybe a game of cards to pass the evening. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and even a man who preferred solitude needed a roof and a fire that he hadn't built himself once in a while. The saloon was crowded with miners and freighters waiting out the storm, the air thick with pipe smoke and the smell of wet wool and whiskey. Jacob had taken a seat at a corner table with 3 other men, 2 miners he knew by sight, and a stranger who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The stranger was maybe 40, thin and haggard, with the kind of hollowed-out eyes that spoke of hard living and harder choices. His hands shook slightly as he dealt the cards, and Jacob noticed the man's coat was worn through at the elbows. They played 5-card draw, nothing fancy. The 2 miners dropped out after a few hands, content to watch and drink. That left Jacob and the stranger, and as the night wore on, the stranger's pile of coins grew smaller and smaller. Jacob wasn't cheating. He never did. But he could read the man's tells as clearly as he could read a game trail in fresh snow. The stranger bet with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I'm out of coin," the stranger finally said, his voice rough and tired. He looked at the few dollars left in front of him, then at Jacob. "But I've got something else." "Property?" Jacob set down his cards. "I'm not looking for property." "It's a lodge," the stranger continued, pulling a folded paper from his inside pocket. "Up in the mountains, north of here, built solid. Good timber. Been in my family 20 years. He laid the deed on the table, and Jacob could see it was official, signed and stamped. The name on it read, Samuel Blackwood. "Why would you bet something like that?" Jacob asked. The stranger, Blackwood's son, Jacob realized, met his eyes for the first time all night. "Because if I don't, I'll lose it anyway. At least this way, it goes to someone who might appreciate it." He paused, then added quietly, "My father built that place. Died there 5 years ago. I can't bear to go back, and I can't bear to sell it to just anyone." There was something in the man's voice that caught Jacob's attention, not just grief, but guilt, a weight that went beyond simple loss. Jacob had carried enough of his own to recognize it in another man. "Your father," Jacob said carefully. "How'd he die?" "They said it was an accident, a fall." Henry Blackwood looked down at his cards. "But I know different. There were men after what he had, what he'd found." He looked up again, and his eyes were clearer now, focused. "If you win, you should know. That lodge holds more than furniture. My father was protecting something worth killing for, apparently." The saloon noise seemed to fade around them. Jacob studied the younger Blackwood, weighing the warning, the strange offer, the story that clearly had more to it than what was being said. "And if I lose," Jacob asked, "then I'll have enough to get out of the territory and never look back," Henry said. "Either way, I'm done with it." Jacob looked at his cards, then at the deed on the table. He thought about his cabin, about another winter of silence and solitude. He thought about how sometimes a man needed a reason to keep going, even if that reason was just a mystery wrapped in a warning from a guilty stranger. "Call," Jacob said, laying down his cards. 3 kings. Henry closed his eyes for a long moment, then placed his own cards face up on the table. A pair of 10s. He stood slowly, picked up the deed and handed it to Jacob. "It's about 60 miles north and east of here. Follow the Clearwater River to where it splits at the big meadow, then head up the eastern branch. You'll find a trail marked with stacked stones. The lodge is at the end of it, up in a small valley." "You're giving me directions?" Jacob asked. "I'm giving you a chance," Henry said. "My father was a good man who tried to do right by people nobody else cared about. If you're the kind of man I think you are, you'll understand when you get there." He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair. "One more thing. If a man named Garrett Moss comes asking about the lodge, don't trust him. Don't trust anything he says." Before Jacob could ask another question, Henry Blackwood walked out into the snowstorm and disappeared. Jacob sat at the table for a long time, holding the deed, wondering what exactly he'd just won and why it felt less like luck and more like fate had just dealt him a hand he couldn't fold. 3 days later, when the storm finally broke and the sky cleared to a hard blue, Jacob packed his saddlebags, loaded his mule and headed north. The deed to Blackwood Lodge felt heavy in his coat pocket, heavier than a piece of paper had any right to feel. Whatever waited for him at the end of that trail, mystery, danger, or just an empty building full of ghosts, Jacob figured he'd rather face it than spend another winter wondering. The journey took him 4 days through country that grew steadily more remote and wild. He followed the Clearwater, as Henry had described, found the meadow where the river split, and picked up the eastern branch. The stacked stones appeared on the second day, old cairns placed at intervals along a game trail that climbed gradually into higher elevation. The forest grew denser, the silence deeper. Jacob saw elk sign and wolf tracks, but no indication that humans had passed this way in months. On the 4th afternoon, the trail opened into a small valley cupped between 3 ridges. And there, sheltered by old-growth pine and positioned to catch the southern sun, stood the lodge. Jacob pulled his horse to a stop and simply looked. It was bigger than he'd expected, built from massive logs that had been carefully notched and fitted. The roof was steep, designed to shed snow, and a wide porch wrapped around the front. The windows were shuttered, the door closed. A stone chimney rose from one end, and beside the lodge stood a smaller structure that was probably a shed or stable. The place looked solid and well built, but it also looked abandoned. Snow lay undisturbed on the porch. No smoke, no tracks, no sign of life. Jacob felt a strange mixture of anticipation and sadness as he dismounted. Someone had put love into building this place, had imagined a life here, and then had died, leaving it empty. He tied his horse and mule to a porch post and climbed the 3 steps to the door. The wood was weathered but sound. Jacob tried the handle, locked. He found the key under a stone near the door, exactly where his instincts told him someone practical would leave it. The lock turned with a harsh scrape of metal on metal. Jacob pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned. He stood on the threshold for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness inside, then stepped across. The interior took his breath away. This wasn't a rough trapper's cabin. This was a home. The main room was large, with the stone fireplace dominating one wall. Furniture stood arranged with care. A solid table with 4 chairs, a desk near the window, bookshelves lining the walls, 2 comfortable chairs positioned near the hearth. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust that spoke of years. Without disturbance, but beneath the dust, Jacob could see quality. The furniture was handmade, but crafted with skill. The books on the shelves were real volumes, not the cheap dime novels you found in mining camps. A woven rug lay before the fireplace, faded but still beautiful. Jacob moved slowly through the space, his boots leaving tracks in the dust. The kitchen area was equipped with good iron cookware. A ladder led to a sleeping loft above. Through a doorway, he found a smaller room with a bed and a trunk. Everything was neat, organized, waiting, as if Samuel Blackwood had just stepped out for the day and would return at any moment. But it was the desk that drew Jacob's attention. Papers lay stacked on its surface, held down by a river stone. A pen and ink bottle sat nearby, and beside them a row of leather-bound journals, their spines cracked with use. Jacob approached the desk slowly, feeling like an intruder despite the deed in his pocket. He picked up the first journal, opened it carefully and read the first entry. Written in a strong, clear hand, April 15th, 1845. Today I begin this record not because I think my life particularly worthy of recording, but because the mountains deserve a witness. I have built my lodge in this valley, and I intend to live here in peace, far from the troubles and hypocrisies of civilization. Here a man can be honest, with himself and with the world. I name this place Blackwood Lodge, and I pray it will be a sanctuary. Jacob read those words twice, feeling something stir in his chest. He understood that sentiment. He understood it completely. Samuel Blackwood had been looking for the same thing Jacob had sought when he fled to the mountains. A place to heal, a place to hide, a place to finally be at peace. He spent the rest of the daylight hours exploring the lodge and its grounds, bringing in his supplies, starting a fire in the great hearth. The chimney drew clean, and soon warmth began to fill the cold space. As the sun set and shadows lengthened, Jacob lit a lamp, settled into one of the chairs by the fire, and began to read Samuel Blackwood's journals. The words pulled him in immediately. Samuel wrote with the careful observation of an educated man and the practical wisdom of someone who'd learned to survive on his own terms. He described building the lodge, hunting and trapping, the changing seasons, encounters with wildlife and occasional travelers. But underneath the daily observations, Jacob sensed something else, a deep loneliness, a grief that Samuel never quite named, but that colored every entry. As the fire burned low and the night deepened outside, Jacob read about Samuel's life in this valley, and slowly, without quite meaning to, he began to feel a connection to a man he'd never met, a man who'd been dead for 5 years, but whose presence still filled this lodge like a quiet ghost. Tomorrow, Jacob decided, he would read more. He would try to understand what Samuel Blackwood had been protecting, what secret his son couldn't bear to face, and why a stranger named Garrett Moss should never be trusted. For tonight, though, Jacob simply sat by the fire in a dead man's house and felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. He felt like he might have found a reason to stay. Jacob spent the first week at Blackwood Lodge, settling into a rhythm that felt both familiar and strange. He cleared the dust, restocked the woodpile, repaired a loose shutter, and hunted fresh meat. During the days, he worked with his hands, making the lodge functional again. During the evenings, he sat by the fire and read Samuel Blackwood's journals, moving chronologically through the years. Samuel's early entries were hopeful, almost optimistic. He wrote about the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, the abundance of game, the beauty of the seasons. But as the years progressed, the tone shifted. Samuel began mentioning trips deeper into the mountains, explorations that took him away from the lodge for days at a time. He wrote less about daily life and more about what he was searching for, though he never quite said what that was. It was on the seventh night, reading by lamplight, that Jacob found the first real clue. The entry was dated September 1847, and Samuel's handwriting looked rushed, excited. "I have found it. After 3 years of searching, I've finally located what the old maps suggested. The site is remote, protected by difficult terrain, but it is everything I hope to find. I cannot write the details here, for such knowledge is dangerous. But I have made my own map, marking the way so that I might return. Tomorrow, I will begin the careful work of documentation and preservation." This discovery changes everything. Jacob read the entry 3 times, then carefully examined the journal. He ran his fingers along the binding, felt for loose pages or hidden pockets. On his 4th inspection, he found it. The back cover was slightly thicker than the front. Using his knife, he carefully worked the leather apart and extracted a folded piece of paper that had been sewn into the binding. It was a map, hand-drawn with meticulous detail. Jacob recognized the valley where the lodge sat, the ridges surrounding it, the river system. But radiating out from the lodge were lines leading to various points in the surrounding mountains, each marked with a symbol Jacob didn't recognize. Some looked vaguely like letters, others like pictographs. Near each symbol, Samuel had written numbers that might be distances or elevations. Jacob spread the map on the desk and studied it by lamplight. Whatever Samuel had found, he'd gone to considerable trouble to hide this information. The map itself was a puzzle, useless to anyone who didn't understand the symbols. And Samuel had been careful never to explain them directly in his journals. Jacob was still examining the map when he heard horses outside, 3 of them from the sound. He folded the map quickly, tucked it inside his shirt and moved to the window. Through a gap in the shutters, he saw 3 men dismounting near the porch. They weren't dressed like trappers or hunters. They wore sturdy trail clothes, but their weapons were too good, their horses too well fed. These were men with money and purpose. Jacob opened the door before they could knock, stepping onto the porch with his rifle held casually but ready. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The man in front was tall and broad-shouldered, maybe 50 years old, with iron-gray hair and cold blue eyes. He looked at Jacob with the assessing gaze of someone used to sizing up obstacles. The 2 men behind him were younger, harder, the kind who got paid to stand behind men like the one in front. "You must be the fellow who won this place off Henry Blackwood," the tall man said. His voice was smooth, educated, but with an edge underneath like a knife wrapped in silk. "I'm Garrett Moss. These mountains are my territory, and I like to know who's moving into the neighborhood." So this was the man Henry had warned him about. Jacob kept his expression neutral. "Jacob Stone. And I'd say these mountains don't belong to anybody, Mr. Moss." Moss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Philosophical. I appreciate that. But let me be direct, Mr. Stone. This lodge and the land it sits on have been of interest to me for some time. I made Samuel Blackwood several generous offers before his unfortunate accident. I'm prepared to make you an even better one." "Not interested in selling," Jacob said. "Just got here. You might want to reconsider." Moss's tone remained pleasant, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tension. "This is isolated country. A man alone can face all sorts of difficulties. Weather accidents, claim disputes. It would be safer and more profitable for you to take my offer and find somewhere else to settle." "That almost sounds like a threat," Jacob said quietly. "A warning," Moss corrected. "I'm trying to be helpful. You see, Samuel Blackwood didn't just own this lodge. He found something in these mountains, something valuable. He refused to share that information, and look what happened to him. I'd hate to see history repeat itself." Jacob felt ice settle in his stomach. The implication was clear enough. Henry Blackwood said his father's death was an accident. Henry Blackwood is a drunk and a coward who ran away rather than face reality, Moss said, his pleasant tone finally cracking to show the hardness beneath. His father was a stubborn fool who died protecting something that should have been shared. I've spent 5 years searching these mountains. I've invested money and time, and I will find what Samuel Blackwood hid, with or without this lodge. "Then I guess you don't need the lodge," Jacob said. "Or me," Moss stared at him for a long moment, and Jacob could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. Finally, Moss nodded slowly. "Think about my offer, Mr. Stone. You've got 3 days. After that, well, I can't guarantee your safety out here. Accidents happen." He turned and walked back to his horse, then paused and looked back. "Oh, and if you found anything interesting in that lodge, maps, papers, journals, I'm willing to pay handsomely for information." Jacob didn't respond, just stood on the porch and watched the 3 men ride away. He waited until they were out of sight, then went back inside and barred the door. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. Moss's visit confirmed everything Henry had implied. Samuel Blackwood had found something, hidden it, and died because of it. And now Moss thought Jacob had inherited not just property, but a secret worth killing for. Jacob pulled out the map again and studied it with new urgency. Whatever Samuel had discovered, it was valuable enough that Moss had spent 5 years searching. Valuable enough to commit murder. And now Jacob was standing between Moss and whatever prize he sought. The question was what to do about it. Jacob had fought in the war, had survived as a scout in hostile territory, knew how to handle himself against men who meant harm, but he also knew when he was outnumbered and outgunned. 3 days wasn't much time to prepare, and he didn't even know what he was preparing for. He spent the next morning checking his supplies and weapons, making sure everything was secure. Around noon, he heard a horse approaching and moved to the window, rifle ready. But this time it was just one rider, an older man on a tired-looking mare. Jacob relaxed slightly when he recognized the type, a trapper probably 70 years old, with a weathered face and kind eyes. The man dismounted slowly, moving with the stiffness of age and hard living. "Name's Tom," the old man called out. "Tom Weathers. I trapped the territory west of here. Saw Moss and his boys heading down the mountain yesterday. Figured I should stop by and see if the new owner needed a friendly face." Jacob stepped onto the porch but kept the rifle. "Jacob Stone. You know Moss?" "Know of him," Tom said, pulling a pipe from his pocket. "Mining man, mostly. Got his start in California, came north when the gold played out. Been working claims in this territory for 8-9 years now. Smart, ruthless, and connected. Got friends in territorial government, can make trouble for folks he doesn't like." "He threatened me," Jacob said. Tom nodded, unsurprised. "He threatened Samuel, too. Difference was, Samuel had been here 20 years and had friends. You're new, alone, and nobody knows you yet." He lit his pipe and puffed thoughtfully. "Mind if I speak plain?" "I'd appreciate it. Moss thinks Samuel found gold or silver somewhere in these mountains. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But Samuel got real careful in his last years. Stopped talking to folks, wouldn't say where he went on his trips. Then he turns up dead at the bottom of a ravine, and everybody says it was an accident. But nobody who knew Samuel believed it. He was too careful, too experienced in these mountains. And nobody did anything about it?" Tom shrugged. "No proof, no witnesses, and like I said, Moss has connections. Sheriff didn't want to pursue it without evidence." He paused, studying Jacob. "You planning to stay?" "Haven't decided yet," Jacob admitted. "But I don't take kindly to being run off." "That's what I figured from the look of you." Tom smiled slightly. "Military man. Was. Scout, mostly. Good. You'll need those skills if you stay." Tom's expression turned serious. "Whatever Samuel found, whatever he was protecting, Moss won't stop until he has it, or until somebody stops him permanently. You should know that before you make your choice." Jacob thought about the map hidden inside his shirt, about Samuel's journals, about the careful way a dead man had tried to protect something he thought was important enough to die for. He thought about Henry's guilt-ridden face and the warning about trust. And he thought about how he'd spent 15 years running from his grief and his past, living but not really being alive. "I appreciate the warning," Jacob said. "And the visit. It's good to know there's at least one honest man in this territory." Tom grinned. "Don't give me too much credit. I'm mostly just nosy and don't like bullies." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. If you need help, I'm about 8 miles west, following the creek. Look for the cabin with the red door. Can't miss it. And if you hear shooting, well, that means Moss's patience ran out. I'll keep that in mind, Jacob said. After Tom left, Jacob went back inside and pulled out Samuel's journals again. Now that he knew what he was looking for, he read with different eyes, looking for clues about what Samuel had found and why it mattered so much. The answer came in an entry from 1848, written in the careful prose of a man choosing his words deliberately. I have decided to dedicate myself to a purpose greater than personal gain. What I have found in these mountains does not belong to me, and it certainly does not belong to men like Moss, who would exploit it for profit. I will spend my remaining years ensuring that what should be protected remains protected, that what should be returned to its rightful place will be returned. This is dangerous work, but it is good work. Perhaps it will give my life the meaning I sought when I first came to these mountains. Jacob sat back, the journal in his hands, and felt the weight of inheritance settle on his shoulders. Samuel Blackwood hadn't been protecting gold or silver. He'd been protecting something else, something he believed had rightful owners who weren't him. And somehow, through a card game with a guilt-ridden son, that mission had passed to Jacob. He looked around the lodge, at the sturdy walls, the comfortable furniture, the shelves of books. This was a home built by a man who cared about things beyond himself. A sanctuary, just as Samuel had written in his first entry, and now it was Jacob's sanctuary if he chose to defend it. Jacob pulled out the map again and studied the symbols. Tomorrow, he decided, he would follow the first marker and see what Samuel had been protecting. He had 3 days before Moss's ultimatum expired. That gave him time to understand what was at stake and decide whether this was a fight worth having. Outside, the sun was setting behind the western ridge, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Jacob stood at the window and watched the light fade, feeling something he hadn't felt since Mary died. He felt purpose stirring, a reason to care about something beyond simple survival. Whatever came next, whatever Moss planned, Jacob knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't running. Not this time. Samuel Blackwood had stood his ground for something he believed in, and Jacob would honor that, even if it cost him everything. The lodge was worth defending, not because of what it was worth in money, but because of what it represented. A good man's last stand against greed and violence, and Jacob had spent too many years running from his own pain to walk away from someone else's unfinished fight. He built up the fire, made coffee, and settled in to study the map by lamplight. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Garrett Moss was making his own plans. Let him. Jacob had survived worse than one crooked mining boss and his hired guns. He'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous men weren't the ones who made threats. They were the ones who kept their word. Jacob woke before dawn, as he had for years, and lay in the darkness of the sleeping loft, listening to the silence of the lodge. The fire had burned down to embers, and frost had formed on the inside of the windows during the night. He dressed quickly, his breath misting in the cold air, and climbed down to restart the fire and make coffee. While the coffee brewed, he studied the map again by lamplight. The first symbol was marked about 3 miles northeast of the lodge, up along a ridge that overlooked a narrow canyon. The symbol itself looked like a combination of lines and curves that meant nothing to Jacob, but Samuel had marked it clearly, and the route looked manageable on foot. Jacob packed light, his rifle, ammunition, some dried meat and hardtack, water, rope, and the map itself. He also took one of Samuel's journals, the one that covered the years when Samuel had begun his mysterious expeditions. If he was going to understand what he'd inherited, he needed to see what Samuel had seen. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of winter day in the mountains, when everything seems sharp-edged and precise. Jacob set out following the route marked on the map, moving with the careful attention of a man who'd learned that carelessness in wild country could be fatal. He saw tracks in the snow, deer, elk, a mountain lion that had passed through during the night, but no human tracks except his own. The terrain grew steeper as he climbed, and by mid-morning he was working his way up a ridge, thick with pine and fir. He stopped periodically to check his bearings against the map, making sure he was following Samuel's route correctly. The old trapper had been precise in his cartography. Every landmark was exactly where the map indicated it should be. Around noon, Jacob reached what he believed was the location Samuel had marked. It was a small clearing on the ridge, with a view down into the canyon below and across to the peaks beyond. At first, Jacob saw nothing unusual, just trees, snow, rocks, but then he noticed the trees themselves. 3 old pines stood in a rough triangle, and on each trunk, about chest height, were carved marks. Not random scratches, but deliberate symbols that matched some of the markings on Samuel's map. Jacob approached the nearest tree and ran his fingers over the carving. It was old, weathered by years of exposure, but still clear, definitely intentional. He examined the other 2 trees and found similar carvings, each slightly different, but clearly part of the same system. Samuel had marked this place, but why? Jacob looked around more carefully, searching for anything that might explain the significance. That's when he noticed the rock cairn, partially hidden by snow and fallen branches near the base of one of the pines. Jacob cleared away the snow and found that someone had carefully stacked stones to create a small, weatherproof cache. His heart beating faster, he began removing stones. Beneath them was a canvas-wrapped bundle, surprisingly well preserved. He lifted it out carefully and carried it to a flat rock where he could examine it properly. Inside the canvas were several items: a leather pouch, a small wooden box, and what looked like a folded piece of hide with markings on it. Jacob opened the leather pouch first and found it contained arrowheads, not crude or random, but beautifully crafted points made from obsidian and flint. Old, Jacob thought, very old. The wooden box held more artifacts, carved bone implements, stone tools, fragments of pottery, all of it carefully wrapped and protected. And the piece of hide, when Jacob unfolded it, revealed itself to be decorated with painted symbols and figures. Not random art, but something that looked ceremonial, meaningful. Jacob sat back on his heels, understanding beginning to dawn. These weren't Samuel's possessions. They were native artifacts, probably Salish or one of the other tribes that had lived in this region for centuries before the settlers came. And Samuel hadn't been searching for gold. He'd been collecting and protecting cultural treasures that were being destroyed or stolen as settlers pushed into the territory. Jacob rewrapped the items carefully and replaced them in the cache, restoring the stones as he'd found them. He understood now why Samuel had been so secretive, why he'd created the coded map. Men like Moss saw native artifacts as curiosities to be sold to Eastern collectors for profit. But Samuel had seen them as something that should be protected, perhaps returned to the people they belonged to. The mission was bigger than Jacob had imagined, and more dangerous. If Moss learned what Samuel had really been doing, he'd either destroy the caches looking for gold or steal the artifacts to sell. Either way, Samuel's work would be undone. Jacob made his way back to the lodge as the afternoon light began to fade, his mind working through the implications. He now understood what he'd inherited, but he had no idea how many caches Samuel had created or where they all were. The map showed at least a dozen marked locations, and he had less than 2 days before Moss's ultimatum expired. When Jacob reached the lodge, he knew immediately that something was wrong. The door stood slightly ajar, though he'd barred it from the outside before leaving. He approached carefully, rifle ready, and pushed the door open with his boot. The interior had been searched. Not ransacked. Whoever had done this was looking for something specific and had been methodical. The desk drawers stood open, papers scattered. The bookshelves had been examined, volumes pulled out and replaced carelessly. Even the kitchen area showed signs of inspection. Jacob checked the sleeping loft and found the same thing. His bedroll had been moved, his pack emptied and repacked. They'd been thorough, but they hadn't destroyed anything. This was reconnaissance, not intimidation. Yet Jacob knew who was responsible, but the question was whether they'd found what they were looking for. The map was safe. He'd taken it with him. But Samuel's journals remained, and Jacob had left them stacked on the desk. He checked them now, and found them all present, but clearly examined. Someone had read through them, probably looking for clear references to locations or treasures. The message was clear. Moss knew Jacob had access to Samuel's records, and he wanted Jacob to understand there was no privacy, no safety, as long as he stayed. It was another form of pressure. Another way of saying that leaving would be easier than staying. Jacob built up the fire and made coffee, forcing himself to think calmly, despite the violation of the search. He needed help, not muscle. He could handle himself in a fight, but information. He needed to understand more about Samuel's mission, about the territory, about who might be allies in this situation. Old Tom had offered help, but Jacob was reluctant to bring danger to an elderly trapper. Still, Tom knew this country and its history. He might know something about Samuel's actual work, might be able to help Jacob understand the full scope of what he was trying to protect. As Jacob was considering his options, he heard another horse approaching. He moved to the window, expecting Moss or one of his men, but the rider this time was different. A woman, riding alone, dressed in practical trail clothes. She was maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back and an alert, intelligent look about her. She dismounted near the porch and called out, "Mr. Stone!" "My name is Sarah Brennan. I'd like to talk to you about Henry Blackwood." Jacob opened the door, rifle still in hand, but pointed down. "You know Henry?" "I've known him since we were children," she said. Her voice was steady, educated. "I'm the postmistress in Bannock. Henry stopped by before he left the territory. He asked me to deliver something to whoever won the lodge, if that person seemed like they might understand." She pulled an envelope from her coat. "He said if you were here after a week, it meant you decided to stay, and you deserved to know the whole story." Jacob stepped back. "Come in, Miss Brennan." She entered, looking around the lodge with what seemed like familiarity. "I visited here a few times when Samuel was alive. He was kind to me, used to trade venison for books from the post office." She handed Jacob the envelope. "Henry was supposed to give you this right away, but his courage failed him. He asked me to make sure you got it if he couldn't face doing it himself." Jacob opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper covered in Henry's unsteady handwriting. The letter was brief but devastating in its honesty. "To whoever owns Blackwood Lodge now, I am a coward and the worst kind of son. My father was protecting something important, something that mattered more than money or property. Garrett Moss wanted what my father had found, and I was too weak to stand with him. I told Moss things I shouldn't have, thinking I could negotiate peace. Instead, I led Moss to my father. I didn't know Moss would kill him, but ignorance doesn't excuse betrayal. I lost the lodge in that card game on purpose, Mr. Stone. I've been watching you for weeks, asking questions. You're a decent man, a careful man, someone who might finish what my father started. I'm giving you what I couldn't protect. Please do better than I did. The symbols on my father's map, some of them are Salish tribal markers. A woman named Sarah Brennan can help you understand them. She knows more than she probably should, but she's trustworthy. I'm sorry for the burden I'm placing on you, but I can't carry it any more. Henry Blackwood." Jacob read the letter twice, then looked up at Sarah Brennan. She met his eyes without flinching. "You know what Samuel was doing?" "He asked. I suspected," she said. "Samuel was educated, curious, respectful. He learned some of the Salish language from traders, started understanding that this territory was sacred to people who'd been here long before us. He'd never told me directly what he was doing, but I put pieces together over the years." She paused. "Henry's letter is right. I can help you understand the symbols if you want my help." Jacob studied her, trying to gauge her motives and her character. She seemed honest, direct, and unafraid. "That counted for something? Why would you help?" "This could be dangerous, because Samuel was one of the few settlers who actually cared about preserving something instead of just taking," she said simply. "And because someone needs to stand up to men like Garrett Moss, or they'll own everything and everyone in this territory." Jacob made a decision. He pulled out Samuel's map and spread it on the desk. "These symbols, can you read them?" Sarah approached and studied the map. her finger tracing some of the markings. Some of them. This one means sacred ground. This one means burial place. This one is a directional marker. She looked up. Samuel was mapping native sites and protecting them. By collecting artifacts and hiding them, Jacob added, I found a cache today. Arrowheads, tools, ceremonial items, to keep them from being stolen or destroyed, Sarah finished. That was Samuel, always trying to fix things, make things right. She studied the map more closely. There are at least 12 marked locations here. That's years of work, and Moss wants this map, Jacob said. He thinks it leads to gold or silver. Let him think that, Sarah said. The truth is more valuable than gold, at least to the people these items belong to. She met Jacob's eyes again. I can help you locate these caches and understand what Samuel was protecting. But we'd need to move quickly. If Moss is pushing you, he won't wait long. Jacob considered the offer. He'd been alone for 15 years, learning to trust only himself. But Samuel's mission was too big for one man, especially one who didn't know the territory or the cultural context. Sarah Brennan seemed capable and committed, and Henry's letter vouched for her, despite everything else Henry had failed at. All right, Jacob said. But you need to understand Moss threatened me. Said I had 3 days. We're down to 2 now. This could get dangerous fast. I've lived in frontier territory my whole life, Sarah said. I understand dangerous, and I'm not afraid of Garrett Moss. Jacob folded the map carefully. Then we start tomorrow. First light. There's a canyon location that looks accessible. We'll check it, see what's there, and start understanding the full scope of Samuel's work. Sarah nodded. I'll bring proper supplies and meet you here at dawn. She moved toward the door, then turned back. Mr. Stone, Henry was right about you. Samuel would have approved of you taking over this place. He always said the mountains would send the right person when the time was right. After she left, Jacob sat by the fire and thought about coincidence and fate. A card game with a desperate stranger. A warning from an old trapper. A letter from a guilt-ridden son. An offer of help from a woman who understood symbols and significance. It all felt like pieces moving on a board, arranging themselves into a pattern he couldn't quite see yet. He pulled out his knife and began working on a hidden compartment in the desk, a place where he could secure Samuel's map and journals when he was away from the lodge. Samuel had been careful, but not careful enough. Jacob wouldn't make the same mistake. As he worked, he thought about what old Tom had told him, that Samuel had been too careful, too experienced to simply fall to his death. And now Henry's letter confirmed it. Moss had killed Samuel, and Henry's weakness had made it possible. Jacob understood guilt. He'd lived with it for 15 years, ever since he'd buried his wife and daughter. The guilt of surviving when they hadn't. The guilt of choosing to live alone, rather than face the pain of connection again. Maybe that's why Henry had chosen him. Not just because Jacob was capable or honorable, but because Jacob understood the weight of failing someone you loved. The hidden compartment complete, Jacob secured the map and selected journals inside it, then carefully disguised the opening. Tomorrow he and Sarah would begin mapping Samuel's caches, understanding the full extent of his work. And eventually they'd have to figure out what to do about Garrett Moss, who wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted or was permanently stopped himself. Jacob checked his weapons, counted his ammunition, and prepared for whatever was coming. He'd made his choice. The lodge was his sanctuary now, and Samuel's mission was his responsibility. He wouldn't run, and he wouldn't surrender. Some things were worth fighting for, even if you'd spent years believing nothing mattered enough to care about. Samuel Blackwood had cared. And now, against all odds and contrary to 15 years of self-imposed isolation, Jacob Stone found that he cared too. Sarah arrived just as the first light touched the eastern peaks, riding a sturdy grey mare and leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. Jacob was already outside, having spent the past hour checking equipment and studying the map by lantern light. He'd selected their next destination, a location marked on the map about 5 miles to the southeast, in a canyon that Samuel had visited multiple times according to his journal entries. "You're prepared," Sarah observed, dismounting and securing her horse next to Jacob's. "Learned a long time ago that preparation prevents problems," Jacob said. He showed her the route he'd planned. According to Samuel's journals, this canyon has water year-round and was used by the Salish as a seasonal camp. If he followed the pattern from the first cache, there should be artifacts hidden somewhere protected. Sarah studied the map, then pulled out a small notebook from her saddlebag. I made some notes last night about the symbols Samuel used. This one here, she pointed to a marking near the canyon location, means place of gathering. It's significant. Not just a campsite, but somewhere people came together for important reasons. They set out together, moving at a steady pace through the cold morning. Jacob noticed that Sarah was comfortable in the wilderness, her movements efficient and her awareness sharp. She rode like someone who'd spent considerable time in wild country, not like a town woman playing at adventure. As they traveled, Sarah told him more about Samuel. He came to the territory in the mid-1840s, during the first wave of settlement. Most men came looking for gold or land, but Samuel seemed to be looking for something else. Peace, maybe, or distance from whatever he'd left behind. Did he ever talk about his past? Jacob asked. Not directly. But I saw him once with a small portrait, a woman and a child. Native, I think, though I couldn't be sure. He put it away quickly when he noticed me looking. She paused. I always wondered if that was why he cared so much about protecting native sites. Maybe he'd lost someone connected to this land. Jacob thought about the grief he'd carried for 15 years, how it had driven him into isolation. If Samuel had lost family too, especially family connected to the Salish people, it would explain the dedication to his mission. Love and loss could motivate a man more powerfully than any desire for wealth. They reached the canyon around mid-morning. It was a beautiful location, sheltered from the worst weather by high walls, with a clear stream running through it and plenty of timber. Jacob could see why it would have been chosen as a gathering place. There was game sign everywhere, deer, elk, even bear tracks from the previous autumn. Samuel's map shows the cache location near a distinctive rock formation, Jacob said, scanning the canyon. Something that looks like a split boulder. They found it after 20 minutes of searching, a massive granite boulder that had cracked down the middle, probably during some ancient frost cycle, creating a narrow gap between the two halves. The gap was just wide enough for a man to squeeze through, and it opened into a small protected space behind the rock. Inside the space, Jacob found another cache, this one larger than the first. More pottery shards, carefully wrapped, stone grinding tools, beadwork on leather, faded but still intact. And something else, a bundle wrapped in what looked like painted hide, decorated with symbols that Sarah gasped when she saw them. That's a prayer bundle, she said quietly, almost reverently, used in healing ceremonies. I've only seen drawings of them in books. For Samuel to have found this and protected it, it must have been in danger of being destroyed or stolen. Jacob carefully replaced everything as he'd found it, understanding that they weren't just protecting objects. They were protecting a people's history, their spiritual practices, their connection to this land. It made what Samuel had done, and what Jacob was now trying to continue, feel weightier, more significant. As they were preparing to leave the canyon, Sarah spoke again. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask, Jacob said, not committing to an answer. Why did you really stay? Most men would have taken Moss's offer and left. This isn't your fight, and you don't owe Samuel Blackwood anything. Jacob was quiet for a moment, checking his horse's saddle, buying time to think about how to answer. Finally, he said, I spent 15 years living, but not really being alive. Just surviving day to day, not caring about much beyond the next meal and the next winter. When I read Samuel's journals, saw what he was trying to do, I recognized something. He'd found a purpose beyond himself, a reason to matter. I guess I wanted to see if I could find that too. Sarah nodded, as if the answer made sense to her. Henry told me you'd lost your wife and child. I'm sorry. I lost my husband 6 years ago. Fever took him one winter and I couldn't do anything but watch. After that I understood why people leave, why they go into the mountains and don't come back. But you stayed in town, Jacob observed. Someone had to run the post office, she said with a slight smile. And I learned that work helps. Being useful helps. Maybe that's what Samuel learned too. They started the ride back to the lodge, both lost in their own thoughts. Jacob was beginning to understand why Henry had trusted Sarah. She had the same qualities Samuel seemed to have, the ability to care about things beyond herself, to see significance in preservation and protection rather than just acquisition and profit. They were about 2 miles from the lodge when Jacob noticed the tracks. Fresh horse prints, at least 4 animals, heading in the same direction they were going. He held up his hand, signaling Sarah to stop, and dismounted to examine them more closely. "How long?" Sarah asked quietly. "Within the last 2 hours," Jacob said. "They're ahead of us, heading for the lodge." They approached the final mile carefully, quietly, leaving the horses tied a 1/4 mile out and moving forward on foot. Through the trees, Jacob could see the lodge, and his worst fears were confirmed. 4 horses stood tied near the porch, and he could see men moving inside through the windows. "Moss," Sarah whispered. Jacob nodded. They'd been careful to leave at dawn, but somehow Moss had known they'd be gone, which meant he was watching the lodge, probably had someone posted within sight. The search Jacob had discovered yesterday hadn't been the end of the pressure. It had been preparation for this. They watched from cover as Moss and 3 men emerged from the lodge. Even from a distance, Jacob could see the frustration on Moss's face. They hadn't found the map or the journals. Those were secure in Jacob's hidden compartment. But the violation of his space, the continued harassment, made Jacob's jaw tighten. Moss stood on the porch and looked around, as if expecting Jacob to materialize. Then he said something to his men, and one of them pulled out a knife and slashed through Jacob's supply sacks that had been hanging from the porch rafters. Flour and dried beans spilled onto the ground. Another man kicked over the woodpile Jacob had carefully stacked. It was petty destruction, the actions of men trying to send a message. Finally, Moss mounted his horse. Before leaving, he pulled out a piece of paper and nailed it to the lodge door with his knife. Then the 4 men rode off, heading back down the mountain the way they'd come. Jacob and Sarah waited a full 30 minutes after the sound of hoofbeats faded before approaching the lodge. Jacob pulled the knife and paper from the door and read Moss's message, written in bold, angry strokes. "Stone, your time is up. I'm filing a legal claim on this property with the territorial court, citing prior mineral rights and inadequate transfer of deed. You'll be ordered off this land within 30 days or removed by force. I suggest you leave now and save yourself the trouble. This is your final warning. G. Moss." Jacob handed the note to Sarah, who read it and shook her head. "He's bluffing about the legal claim. The deed is legitimate, and there's no record of prior mineral rights. But he can tie you up in court for months, cost you money you probably don't have, and make your life miserable. That's the point," Jacob said. "He wants me to leave voluntarily because forcing me off legally is complicated. But if I stay, he'll use every tool he has, legal harassment, intimidation, maybe worse." Sarah looked at the destroyed supplies, the scattered wood, the general vandalism. "This is escalating. What will you do?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm going to keep doing what Samuel did. Find the caches, protect them, and figure out what Samuel intended as the end game. Because I don't think he was just hiding these artifacts. He had a plan for them. I need to understand what that was." They spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning up the damage and securing the lodge. Sarah helped him restock the supplies and repair what had been broken. As they worked, Jacob noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small photograph tucked into the frame of Samuel's shaving mirror, partially hidden behind the glass. He carefully extracted it and found himself looking at a faded image from perhaps 25 years earlier. A younger Samuel stood next to a native woman, both of them holding a small child between them. The woman was beautiful, with long dark hair and a gentle smile. The child couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 years old. "That's what I saw," Sarah said softly, looking over his shoulder. The portrait he put away so quickly. Jacob turned the photograph over and found names written on the back in Samuel's handwriting. "Ayasha, little bird myself, 1849. "His family," Jacob said quietly. Sarah nodded. "That would explain everything. Why he learned the language, why he cared so much, why he dedicated his life to protecting their heritage. What happened to them? Jacob wondered aloud. Samuel never said, but given that he was alone when I knew him, probably nothing good. Sarah's voice held the understanding of someone who'd also lost people she loved. Loss changes people, makes them want to protect what they couldn't save. Jacob carefully replaced the photograph, but the image stayed with him. Samuel hadn't just been a good man trying to do right by strangers. He'd been a husband and father who'd lost everything, who'd chosen to spend his remaining years honoring the people his wife had come from. It made his mission personal in a way Jacob deeply understood. That evening, after Sarah had returned to town with promises to come back in 2 days with more information about the Salish symbols, Jacob sat by the fire and reread Samuel's journals with new eyes. Now he could see the grief beneath the careful prose, the determination born from loss, the way Samuel had channeled his pain into purpose. In a journal from 1851, Samuel had written, "Ayasha and Little Bird died of the fever that swept through the Salish camps 3 winters ago. I could not save them, though I tried everything I knew. Now I am alone, and the world seems emptier than I ever imagined possible. But I have decided that my grief will not be wasted. I will honor Ayasha's people by protecting what they hold sacred. It is the only way I know to keep her memory alive and to give Little Bird's short life some meaning. This is my promise to them both." Jacob set down the journal and stared into the fire. Samuel's story and his own ran parallel, both men destroyed by the loss of their families, both fleeing into the mountains, both searching for a reason to keep living. The difference was that Samuel had found his purpose, had transformed his grief into something meaningful. Jacob was only beginning to understand that the same opportunity now lay before him. He thought about Moss's threat, about the legal harassment and intimidation to come. He thought about the 12 marked locations on the map, about the artifacts hidden and waiting to be understood. And he thought about Sarah's willingness to help, about old Tom's offer of friendship, about how isolation had kept him safe, but also kept him from living. Samuel had written in his final journal entries about hoping someone would continue his work. Henry had chosen Jacob for that role, had recognized in him the qualities needed: honor, determination, the ability to care about something beyond himself. Now Jacob had to decide if he was worthy of that trust. The fire burned low, and Jacob added more wood, watching the flames catch and grow. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the lodge's corners, the sound of winter deepening in the high country. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Moss would continue his pressure, the legal threats would materialize, and the work of locating and understanding Samuel's caches would continue. But tonight, Jacob felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. He felt connected to something larger than his own survival. Samuel's mission was his mission now. Ayasha and Little Bird, though dead for decades, deserved to have their heritage protected. The Salish people, still living on this land their ancestors had held sacred for generations, deserved to have their history preserved. Jacob pulled out a blank journal he'd found in the lodge and opened it to the first page. If he was going to continue Samuel's work, he needed to document it properly, just as Samuel had done. He dipped a pen in ink and began to write. "My name is Jacob Stone, and I have inherited a responsibility I never sought but now cannot refuse. Samuel Blackwood spent 20 years protecting what others would destroy or steal. He did this for love, for honor, and for redemption. I begin this journal to continue his work and to honor his memory. If someone else must take up this burden after me, they will know what was done and why it mattered." He paused, then added one more line. "Samuel once wrote that the mountains don't lie. I understand now what he meant. In these mountains, a man finds out who he really is and what he's truly capable of caring about. I thought I came here to hide. Instead, I found a reason to stand and fight." Jacob closed the journal and placed it beside Samuel's, in the hidden compartment. Tomorrow would test his resolve. Moss wouldn't stop, and the danger would only increase. But Jacob had made his choice. He was staying, and he was continuing Samuel's mission. Some fights were worth having, even against long odds. Some legacies were worth protecting, even at personal cost. Jacob had spent 15 years learning how to survive alone. Now he would learn how to live for something beyond himself. The photograph of Samuel with Ayasha and Little Bird remained in the shaving mirror, a reminder of what love could inspire a man to do. Jacob understood that inspiration now, and he was ready for whatever came next. 2 days later, Sarah returned to the lodge as promised, but she wasn't alone. She brought news from town and information that changed Jacob's understanding of what they were facing. Sheriff Clayton was in Bannock yesterday, she said, as they sat at the lodge table with coffee. Moss filed his legal claim just as he threatened. Clayton seemed skeptical about it, but he's bound by law to investigate. He'll be coming here within the week to examine the deed and hear Moss's case. Will he be fair? Jacob asked. Clayton's a good man, as far as territorial sheriffs go. He won't be bought by Moss, but he also won't ignore legal procedures. If Moss can create enough doubt about the deed's validity, Clayton will have to order you off the property until a territorial judge can rule. She paused. That could take months, and Moss knows you don't have the resources to fight a legal battle that long. Jacob nodded, accepting the reality. Then we work faster. We need to locate and document all of Samuel's caches before I'm forced off this land. Once we know what we're protecting, we can figure out the next step. Sarah pulled out her notebook. I spent yesterday talking to some of the older residents who remember Samuel from his early years here. One of them, a trader named Walsh, said Samuel used to visit the Salish camps regularly, that he'd married into the tribe and was respected by the elders. I found a photograph, Jacob said. He showed her the image of Samuel with Ayasha and Little Bird, his wife and daughter. They died of fever. Sarah's expression softened. That explains his dedication. He wasn't just an outsider trying to do good. He was protecting his own family's heritage. She studied the photograph. If the Salish elders knew about Samuel's work, they might be willing to help us now. Do you know any of them? Jacob asked. I know of them. There's a winter camp about 20 miles west, near the hot springs. The elders gather there during the cold months. It's led by a man named Joseph Three Horses. He's respected throughout the territory, known for being wise and fair. She looked at Jacob carefully. If we could get word to him, explain what Samuel was doing and what we're trying to protect, he might be able to offer guidance. Jacob thought about it. Involving others meant expanding the circle of trust, which went against his instincts. But Sarah was right. They needed help, needed to understand the full scope of Samuel's plan. And if Joseph Three Horses had known Samuel, he might already know about the caches. Can you get a message to him? Jacob asked. I have contacts among the traders who work with the Salish. I can send word through them. Sarah made a note in her book. It might take a week or more for a response, but it's worth trying. They spent the rest of that day examining Samuel's journals in detail, looking for patterns and clues about his methodology. Jacob had been reading chronologically, but now they approached it differently, looking for specific information about each cache location. What emerged was a picture of careful, patient work spanning nearly 2 decades. Samuel had started small, protecting individual items he found at abandoned campsites or locations threatened by mining operations. Over time, he developed relationships with some of the Salish people, had learned which sites were most sacred, which artifacts most important. His journal from 1853 contained a crucial entry. Joseph Three Horses visited today. We spoke at length about my work, and he gave me his blessing to continue. He said the old ways are disappearing, that his people are being pushed from their lands and losing their connection to sacred places. He asked if I would help preserve what can be preserved, so that future generations might reclaim what is being taken from them now. I agreed. This is no longer just my work. It is a trust given to me by people I respect and honor. So Joseph knew, Sarah said, reading over Jacob's shoulder. He was part of this from the beginning, Jacob nodded. Which means when we contact him, we're not explaining something new. We're continuing a partnership Samuel already established. He felt relief at this discovery. They weren't operating alone or making decisions about cultural artifacts without proper authority. Samuel had been working with the Salish elders all along. They continued mapping out the cache locations, cross-referencing Samuel's journals with the symbols on the map. By evening, they had identified 8 of the 12 locations with reasonable certainty, understanding what each site protected and why it mattered. "The largest cache is here," Sarah said, pointing to a location in disputed territory near an old mining claim. Samuel visited it multiple times in his final year. Whatever he hid there, it was significant enough that he kept checking on it. Jacob studied the location. "That's close to where Moss has his base camp now. If we're going to reach it, we'll need to be careful, or we wait until after Clayton's investigation." "Until we have more support," Sarah suggested. Before Jacob could respond, they heard a horse approaching fast. Both of them moved to the window, Jacob reaching for his rifle. But it was old Tom, riding hard despite his age, his face flushed with exertion. Jacob opened the door and helped the old man dismount. "What's wrong?" "Moss," Tom gasped, catching his breath. "He's been asking around town about you, about your background. He's trying to find something to use against you. Some way to discredit your claim to this property." Sarah and Jacob exchanged glances. "What kind of information?" Jacob asked. "Everything. Where you're from, how you got here, whether you have any legal problems in your past. He's also been talking to some rough characters from the mining camps, men who work cheap and don't ask questions." Tom accepted the water Sarah offered him. "I think he's planning something beyond the legal claim. I think he's preparing to force you off this land by any means necessary." Jacob felt the situation crystallizing. Moss wasn't just using intimidation and legal pressure. He was preparing for violence, gathering men and information to justify whatever action he planned. The polite warnings and formal threats were over. Now came the real danger. "How much time do we have?" Jacob asked. "Days, maybe. A week at most." Tom looked around the lodge. "You should consider leaving, son. This place isn't worth your life." "It's not about the place," Jacob said quietly. "It's about what Samuel was protecting. And I'm not running." Tom studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that. You've got the same stubborn look Samuel had toward the end." "All right, then. If you're staying, you'll need help. I know a few men in the territory, good men who didn't care for Moss's methods. I can put the word out. I don't want anyone getting hurt on my account," Jacob said. "Too late for that kind of thinking," Tom replied. "Moss has been pushing people around for years. Some folks are ready to push back if they have someone worth standing behind." He looked at Sarah. "You planning to keep helping him?" "I am," Sarah said firmly. "Then you both better understand what's coming. Moss doesn't bluff and he doesn't forgive. If he decides to move against you, it won't be subtle and it won't be legal. He'll bring enough men to overwhelm any resistance, and he'll justify it later with his territorial connections." Jacob appreciated the old trapper's honesty. "What would you do if you were me?" Tom thought about it, then said, "I'd finish Samuel's work as fast as possible. Document everything. Secure what needs securing, and make sure that even if Moss takes this lodge, he doesn't get what he's really after. Then I'd make sure the right people know what Samuel was doing and why it matters. That way, even if you lose the battle, you win the war." It was sound advice. Jacob looked at Sarah. "How fast can you get word to Joseph 3 Horses?" "I'll leave tonight. Go straight to the traders I know. If they can reach the winter camp quickly, we might have a response in 4 or 5 days." "Do it," Jacob said. "And tell them we need help now, not eventually. Tell them Samuel's work is in danger of being destroyed or stolen, and we need guidance on how to protect it properly." After Tom and Sarah left, Jacob spent the evening preparing. He organized Samuel's journals chronologically, marking the most important entries. He made detailed copies of the map, hiding the original and keeping a duplicate on his person at all times. He checked his weapons and ammunition, positioned supplies strategically around the lodge, and identified escape routes if retreat became necessary. But even as he prepared for potential violence, Jacob found himself thinking about Samuel's journals, about the careful way a grieving man had transformed his pain into purpose. Samuel could have let his loss destroy him, could have drowned in bitterness and despair. Instead, he'd chosen to honor what he'd lost by protecting what remained. Jacob understood that choice now, felt the same transformation happening in himself. For 15 years, he'd let grief make him small, had reduced his life to simple survival. But Samuel's legacy was pulling him back into the world, forcing him to care about something beyond his own pain. There was a knock at the door, gentle but firm. Jacob grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, then relaxed slightly when he saw it was Sarah. She'd come back. "I thought you were leaving tonight," he said, opening the door. "I am. But first, I wanted to make sure you understood something." She stepped inside, and in the lamplight, Jacob could see the worry in her eyes. "Tom's right about the danger. Moss is capable of terrible things. You don't have to do this, Jacob. You could leave and no one would think less of you." "I would," Jacob said simply. Sarah smiled sadly. "I know, that's why I'm worried." She paused, then continued. "My husband, before he died, he used to say that some men spend their whole lives looking for a reason to matter. You found yours. I just hope it doesn't cost you everything." "Your husband was a wise man," Jacob said. "He was. And he'd probably tell you the same thing I'm about to say." She met his eyes directly. "Don't do this alone. Let people help. Let me help. Whatever Samuel started, whatever you're continuing, it's bigger than one person." That's probably why Samuel partnered with Joseph Three Horses in the first place. Jacob was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. I've spent too long thinking I had to carry everything myself." He gestured to the journals and maps spread across the table. "This is too important to let pride or old habits get in the way." "Good," Sarah said. She moved toward the door, then turned back one more time. 4 or 5 days? If Joseph responds, we'll have real help. Until then, be careful. And if things get too dangerous, promise me you'll get out." "I promise I'll try," Jacob said, which was the most honest answer he could give. After Sarah left, Jacob sat at the desk where Samuel had written his journals, where he'd recorded 20 years of careful work and quiet dedication. Jacob pulled out his own journal and added a new entry. "Tonight I learned that Samuel's work was never meant to be carried alone. He had partners, had the blessing and support of the people he was trying to help. I've spent 15 years believing that isolation was strength, that needing no one made me safe." Samuel knew better. His strength came from connection, from purpose larger than himself. "I'm learning that lesson now, though perhaps later than I should have. If Moss comes, he'll find I'm not alone. And if I fall, others will continue what Samuel started." That's the difference between surviving and truly living. Understanding that some things are worth more than one life. One loss, one man's grief. Jacob closed the journal and extinguished the lamp, sitting in darkness lit only by the fire's glow. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound was lonely but not alone. Other wolves answered, pack calling to pack. Jacob understood the message. He'd been the lone wolf for too long. Now it was time to remember that even wolves survive by finding their pack, by running together, by protecting what matters as a community rather than as isolated individuals. Samuel had understood that, and now finally so did Jacob. 3 days passed with no word from Sarah or the Salish elders. Jacob used the time to visit 2 more cache locations, carefully documenting what Samuel had protected at each site. He moved cautiously, always watching for signs that Moss had men tracking him. Twice he spotted distant riders and changed his route, using his old scout skills to stay ahead of observation. On the 4th morning, Sheriff Clayton arrived at the lodge. Jacob had been expecting the visit and had prepared accordingly, making sure the deed was readily available and that nothing in the lodge suggested illegal activity or gave Moss ammunition for his claims. Clayton was in his mid-40s, weathered by frontier life, but carrying himself with the careful authority of a man who'd learned when to push and when to listen. He dismounted slowly, giving Jacob time to assess him, and approached with his hands visible and empty. "Mr. Stone, I'm Sheriff Clayton. I'd like to talk with you about this property and Mr. Moss's legal claim." Jacob gestured to the porch. "Coffee's hot if you want some." They sat on the porch in the cold morning air, and Clayton accepted the coffee gratefully. He pulled out a leather folder containing official-looking documents and set them on the small table between them. "I'll be straight with you," Clayton said. Garrett Moss filed a formal complaint alleging that the deed transfer from Henry Blackwood was fraudulent, that the property has prior mineral claims attached, and that you're occupying disputed territory. He's demanding a territorial review and wants you removed pending that review. "And what do you think?" Jacob asked. Clayton sipped his coffee before answering. "I think Moss has been trying to get his hands on this property for years, and I think Samuel Blackwood's death wasn't the accident everyone said it was. But thinking something and proving it are different things." He pulled out Jacob's deed. "This is legitimate, filed properly, signed, witnessed. Henry Blackwood had every legal right to transfer it, and you have every legal right to own it. So Moss's claim has no merit. His claim about fraudulent transfer doesn't, but the mineral rights issue is more complicated. There are some old territorial filings from the 1850s that show prospecting claims in this general area. Moss is arguing those claims extend to this property and that Samuel Blackwood never properly secured mineral rights when he built here." Jacob thought about Samuel's journals, about how carefully he'd documented everything. Did Samuel register this property officially when he first settled here? He did. 1845, proper territorial claim, approved and recorded. But back then, mineral rights weren't always separately documented. It's a legal gray area Moss is exploiting. What happens now? Clayton set down his coffee cup. "Technically, I should order you off the property until a territorial judge can review the claim. That's what Moss wants. But the nearest judge won't be through this territory for at least 2 months, maybe longer depending on weather." He paused, studying Jacob. "However, I have discretion in how I enforce these things. If I believe the current occupant has legitimate claim and isn't a danger to the community, I can allow them to stay pending review. And do you believe that?" Jacob asked. "I believe you won this property legally and that Moss is using the legal system to bully you off land he wants for his own purposes." Clayton's expression hardened. "But I also need you to understand something, Mr. Stone. If there's violence, if anyone gets hurt, I'll have to act regardless of who started it. Moss knows this. He's counting on provoking you into doing something that gives me no choice but to remove you." "I'm not looking for violence," Jacob said. "I didn't think you were. Former military, if I'm reading you right? Scout?" Jacob nodded. "Then you know about patience and strategy. Good, you're going to need both." Clayton gathered his papers. "I'm ruling that your deed is valid, and you can stay on the property pending territorial review. I'll file that decision today. It'll make Moss angry, but it's the right call legally." "Thank you, Sheriff." Clayton stood but didn't immediately move toward his horse. "Off the record, Mr. Stone, I'd like to know what Samuel Blackwood was really doing out here. Moss claims he found gold or silver. My gut tells me it was something else." Jacob made a decision. Clayton seemed honest, seemed like someone who might understand. "Can I show you something?" He led Clayton inside and pulled out Samuel's journals, showing him selected entries about protecting native sites and artifacts. He explained about the caches, about Ayasha and Little Bird, about Samuel's partnership with Joseph Three Horses. Clayton read silently, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he looked up. "This is what Moss is after? Native artifacts? He thinks it's precious metals. If he knew the truth, he'd probably try to steal the artifacts and sell them to Eastern collectors. Either way, Samuel's work gets destroyed, and you're trying to continue what he started. I'm trying to protect it until it can be properly returned to the Salish people. That's what Samuel intended." Clayton was quiet for a long moment, then carefully closed the journal. "This puts me in a difficult position. What you're describing, protecting cultural artifacts, working with the tribes, that's admirable. But it's also potentially dangerous if Moss decides to force the issue." "I understand that," Jacob said. "I don't think you do." Clayton's voice was serious. "Moss has friends in the territorial government. He's connected to mining interests that have significant influence. If he decides you're standing between him and something valuable, he won't stop at legal harassment. And when violence comes, I might not be able to get here in time to prevent it. What would you do if you were me? Jacob asked, echoing the question he'd posed to old Tom. Clayton smiled grimly. I'd finish whatever Samuel started as quickly as possible, document everything, and make sure multiple people knew about it. That way, even if Moss takes the lodge, he doesn't get what he really wants. And I'd keep my rifle loaded. He moved toward the door, then turned back. One more thing. There's a leather-bound ledger in the territorial office in Virginia City. Samuel filed it there 10 years ago. It's labeled as a surveying record, but I always suspected it was something more. You might want to look at it if you can get there. What's in it? Jacob asked. I don't know. Sealed record, only to be opened by Samuel Blackwood or his designated successor. Since you own his property, you'd probably qualify. Clayton mounted his horse. 2 months until the judge arrives. Use that time wisely, Mr. Stone, and watch your back. After Clayton left, Jacob sat on the porch and thought about the ledger. If Samuel had filed an official record in Virginia City, it might contain information about all the cache locations. Might be the complete inventory Clayton had mentioned. But Virginia City was 3 days' ride away, and leaving the lodge unguarded for that long seemed dangerous with Moss actively watching. He was still considering his options when he saw riders approaching. 3 of them, but not Moss's men. As they got closer, Jacob recognized Sarah in front, with 2 native men riding beside her. One was elderly, with long gray hair and a face that spoke of wisdom earned through decades. The other was younger, perhaps 30, with the alert bearing of a warrior. Sarah dismounted quickly, her expression both excited and relieved. Jacob, this is Joseph Three Horses and his grandson. Running Deer. They came as soon as they got my message. Joseph Three Horses dismounted with the careful dignity of age and approached Jacob. He studied him for a long moment, then spoke in English that carried only a slight accent. Sarah tells me you have taken up Samuel Blackwood's work, that you are protecting what he protected. I'm trying to, yes. Jacob said, why? The question was direct, searching. Jacob thought about how to answer, then decided on simple honesty. Because he cared about it, and because it deserves to be protected, and because I needed a reason to care about something again. Joseph nodded slowly, as if the answer satisfied him. Samuel was my friend. He married into our people, lost his family to sickness, and spent the rest of his life honoring them. His work was sacred work. He paused. Show me what you have found. Jacob led them inside and spread out the map, the journals and his notes documenting the caches they'd located. Joseph examined everything carefully, occasionally translating symbols for running deer in their own language. Finally, he looked up at Jacob. You have done well. But the most important cache remains. There is an item that Samuel protected above all others, a ceremonial headdress that belonged to a great chief of our people. It was thought lost when the miners destroyed a burial site 20 years ago. Samuel recovered it and hid it where Moss and his men would never find it. Joseph's expression grew grave. This headdress represents our people's leadership and connection to the old ways. Its return would heal wounds that have festered for 2 decades. Where is it? Jacob asked. At the place where Samuel died, Joseph said quietly. At the old mining camp that Moss now uses as his base. Samuel went there 5 years ago to check on the headdress, to make sure it remained safe. Moss followed him, demanded to know what he was protecting. When Samuel refused to tell him, there was a confrontation. Samuel fell or was pushed and died protecting the hiding place. The room was silent for a moment as everyone absorbed this information. Finally, Sarah spoke. If the headdress is at Moss's camp, how can we possibly retrieve it? We must, Joseph said simply. It is the most important piece, the one that matters most to my people. Without it, Samuel's work remains incomplete. Jacob studied the map, trying to think strategically. Does the map show exactly where it's hidden? Joseph examined the marking near the old mining camp. Samuel was careful. The map shows the general area, but not the exact location. He told me once that he had marked it with words only I would understand. He said if something happened to him, I would know where to look. What were the words? Jacob asked. Under the mountain's eye, where water meets stone. Joseph's voice was sad, but I have never understood what he meant. There are many mountains, much water, many stones. Jacob pulled out Samuel's journals, looking for any reference to those words or that phrase. He found it in an entry from 5 years ago, one of the last Samuel had written. Today I moved the headdress to its final resting place. If I should fall and cannot complete my mission, the location can be found at the place where the mountain watches over the water's birth. Joseph will understand when the time comes. I pray that time never arrives, but I am realistic about the dangers I face. The water's birth, Sarah said thoughtfully. A spring where water emerges from the ground. Running Deer spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but certain. There is a rock formation near the old camp. It looks like an eye in the mountain's face. A spring flows from beneath it. The miners called it Devil's Eye, but our people always knew it as a sacred place. Joseph nodded slowly. Yes, that would be like Samuel, to hide something sacred in a place that had been desecrated but still held power. He looked at Jacob. Can you reach this place without Moss knowing? I can try, Jacob said, but it'll be dangerous. If he has men posted, if he's watching the area, then you will need help, Joseph interrupted. Running Deer and 2 other warriors will go with you. They know the land, know how to move unseen. I don't want to start a war, Jacob said carefully. This is not about war, Joseph said. This is about recovering what belongs to my people, what Samuel died protecting. We will not attack Moss or his men unless they force our hand. But we will not leave the headdress in their hands either. Jacob looked at Sarah, who nodded. Then at Running Deer, who met his eyes with calm confidence. Finally, he looked back at Joseph's 3 horses, at the weathered face of a man who'd seen his people lose much and was trying to preserve what remained. All right, Jacob said. We do this carefully, quietly. We recover the headdress and get out without confrontation if possible. But if Moss or his men discover us, then we protect what must be protected, Joseph finished. As Samuel did. They spent the rest of the day planning. Running Deer sketched the terrain around the old mining camp from memory, marking where Moss likely had men posted, where the approach would be easiest, where the Devil's Eye formation stood. Jacob contributed his knowledge of scouting and tactical movement, while Sarah identified potential escape routes based on her understanding of the territory. By evening, they had a plan. They would move tomorrow at first light, approaching the camp from the east, where the terrain was most difficult, but least likely to be watched. Running Deer and another warrior would scout ahead, ensuring the route was clear. Jacob and a 3rd warrior would approach the Devil's Eye formation, while Running Deer created a distraction, if needed, on the opposite side of the camp. It was risky, but it was also their best chance. And the more Jacob learned about the headdress and what it meant to Joseph's people, the more he understood why Samuel had died protecting it. This wasn't just an artifact. It was a symbol of leadership, of cultural continuity, of connection to ancestors and traditions. Losing it had wounded the Salish people deeply. Recovering it would begin healing that wound. That night, Joseph and Running Deer made camp near the lodge. Jacob offered them the interior, but Joseph declined. We are comfortable under the sky. The lodge is yours now, as it was Samuel's. We respect that. Before they settled for the night, Joseph approached Jacob on the porch. I want you to understand something about Samuel. When he first came to these mountains, he was running from grief, just as you were. But he learned that grief can be transformed, that loss can become purpose. He loved my daughter deeply, and when she and their child died, part of him died too. But the better part of him survived and chose to honor what he had lost by protecting what remained. Your daughter, Jacob said, understanding flooding through him. Ayasha was your daughter, she was, and Little Bird was my granddaughter. Joseph's voice carried the weight of old pain, pain that had been weathered by time but never fully healed. Samuel became my son when he married Ayasha. When they died, I lost him too for a time. But his grief found purpose, and in that purpose, he returned to me in a different way. We became partners in protecting what matters, in preserving what the rush for gold and land was destroying. I'm sorry for your loss, Jacob said. And I for yours, Joseph replied. Sarah told me about your wife and child. We are bound by similar griefs, you and I and Samuel. Perhaps that is why you are here now, why Samuel's legacy passed to you. The mountains send us what we need when we need it, even if we do not recognize it at the time. After Joseph returned to the campfire, Jacob sat alone on the porch and thought about the connection that had been revealed. Samuel hadn't been an outsider helping strangers. He'd been family, protecting his wife's people, honoring his daughter's heritage. And Joseph hadn't been just a tribal elder giving permission. He'd been a father who'd lost his daughter and granddaughter, working alongside the son-in-law who'd survived them. The weight of that relationship, that shared grief, transformed into shared purpose, made Jacob's responsibility feel even more significant. He wasn't just continuing a good man's work. He was honoring a family's legacy, helping a grieving father complete what he and his son-in-law had started together. Jacob pulled out his journal and wrote by lamplight, trying to capture the day's revelations. Tonight, I learned that Samuel's mission was even more personal than I understood. He was protecting his wife's people, his daughter's heritage, his father-in-law's culture. The lodge I thought was a sanctuary for a lonely man was actually a base for family work, for the kind of purpose that comes from love rather than duty. I understand now why Henry felt such guilt. He didn't just betray a good man's trust. He betrayed his father's love for Ayasha and Little Bird, betrayed the family Samuel had built and tried to honor even after death took them. Tomorrow we attempt to recover what Samuel died protecting. If we succeed, we complete not just his mission, but a promise made to a wife and daughter now 20 years dead. Some promises transcend death. Some loves create obligations that survive beyond one lifetime. I am privileged to help fulfill such a promise. Jacob closed the journal and looked out at the night sky. The stars were brilliant in the cold, clear air, countless points of light against infinite darkness. Somewhere among those stars, he liked to think, Mary and his unnamed daughter watched. And perhaps Ayasha and Little Bird watched too, waiting to see if the men they'd left behind could finish what grief and love had inspired them to begin. Tomorrow would test them all. Moss wouldn't give up the headdress willingly, even if he didn't know what it was. And the danger of confrontation, of violence, of failure, was real and immediate. But so was the possibility of success, of completion, of honoring those who died by protecting what they'd valued. Jacob checked his rifle one more time, made sure his knife was sharp, and laid out his gear for the morning. He'd learned long ago that preparation prevented panic, that careful planning gave courage room to work. Tomorrow they would need both planning and courage in equal measure. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Jacob felt something beyond simple survival. He felt purpose, connection, and the knowledge that what he was doing mattered to people beyond himself. Samuel had felt the same way, and it had sustained him through 20 years of difficult, dangerous work. If a grieving widower could transform his pain into protection, if a heartbroken father-in-law could channel his loss into preservation, then Jacob could do the same. The lodge had given him more than shelter. It had given him a reason to matter, a way to honor his own lost family by protecting someone else's legacy. The fire burned low, and Jacob added one more log before going up to the sleeping loft. Tomorrow would begin early, would be long, and potentially dangerous. But he was ready. He'd been preparing for this his entire life, though he hadn't known it until now. Some men spent their whole lives searching for a reason to care. Jacob had found his, hidden in a dead man's journals, protected by a grieving father-in-law, and waiting in the form of a ceremonial headdress that represented more than objects ever could. It represented love, loss, honor, and the belief that some things were worth dying to protect. Samuel had believed that. Joseph believed it. And now so did Jacob. He fell asleep to the sound of wind in the pines and the quiet voices of Joseph and running deer, speaking in their own language by the campfire. The words were foreign to him, but the tone was universal. The sound of people preparing for important work, of family planning together, of purpose, binding individuals into something larger than themselves. Jacob understood that sound now. For 15 years he'd lived in silence, alone, disconnected. Now he was part of something, connected to others through shared purpose and mutual respect. It felt strange and right at the same time, like a piece of himself he'd lost was slowly being restored. Tomorrow they would face danger together. But tonight, Jacob slept better than he had in years, surrounded by allies rather than alone, working towards something that mattered rather than simply surviving. Samuel's legacy had done that for him, and tomorrow they would do their best to complete what Samuel had started, to honor what Ayasha and Little Bird had meant to two grieving men who'd refused to let death have the final word. Jacob woke before dawn to find Joseph already awake, sitting by the rekindled fire and looking toward the eastern horizon. The old man seemed to be praying or meditating, his lips moving silently in what Jacob assumed was his native language. Running Deer was checking their horses and equipment with the careful attention of someone who understood that small oversights could become large problems. They ate a quick breakfast of coffee and cold biscuits. Then Jacob went inside to gather the last items they'd need for the journey. As he was securing Samuel's compass in his coat pocket, he noticed something odd about Samuel's desk. The morning light was hitting it at an angle he hadn't seen before, and there appeared to be a slight gap in the wood grain that didn't match the surrounding pattern. Jacob ran his fingers along the desktop and found what felt like a hidden seam. He pressed and probed carefully until he heard a soft click. A small compartment sprang open in the desk's surface, so cunningly concealed that Jacob had walked past it dozens of times without noticing. Inside the compartment was a single sealed envelope, yellowed with age, but still intact. On the outside, in Samuel's handwriting, was written, "To the one who cares enough to look." Jacob's heart beat faster as he carefully opened the seal. Inside was a letter dated 5 years earlier, written in Samuel's hand, but with the unsteady quality that suggested it had been composed under stress or in haste. To whoever finds this, if you are reading these words, it means I am dead and someone has taken up the work I could not finish. I write this in secret, for I believe I am being watched and my time is growing short. Garrett Moss has learned about the headdress. I do not know how, but he knows, and he is determined to take it. Not because he understands its significance, but because he believes it is made of gold and adorned with valuable stones. He is wrong about its material value, but right about its importance. I'm preparing to move it one final time, to the place where Moss will never think to look. But I am afraid, not for myself, but for what will happen if I fail. Henry knows about my work, but he is weak, and Moss has been pressuring him for information. I fear my son may betray me, not from malice, but from fear. If he does, I cannot blame him. He has never understood what drives me, has never grasped why these artifacts matter more than gold or comfort. Tonight I leave to check the headdress one final time. If I do not return, please understand that I went willingly to protect what matters. The headdress is hidden at the place where the mountain watches over the water's birth. Moss knows the general area, but not the specific location. I've carved a marker, 3 interlocking circles, the symbol Ayasha used to mark our home, on the rock face above the hiding place. Only someone who knew her would recognize its significance. Joseph 3 Horses will understand this letter. He will know what to do. Please give him my journals, my map, and this letter. Tell him I tried to keep my promise to Ayasha, to protect her people's heritage. Tell him I died as his son, honoring the family I was privileged to join. And please, whoever you are, finish what I could not. The headdress must be returned to Joseph's people. It represents their past, their identity, their connection to leaders who came before. In these changing times, such connections matter more than ever. Samuel Blackwood. Jacob read the letter twice, his mind racing. Samuel had known Moss was coming for him, had known Henry might betray him, had prepared this final message, knowing he might not survive to deliver it himself. The courage that took, the clarity of purpose, even in the face of death, struck Jacob deeply. But there was more to the letter than just Samuel's final words. There was a crucial piece of information, The marker showing the exact hiding place was 3 interlocking circles, Ayesha's personal symbol. Joseph would recognize it. More importantly, Moss wouldn't know what it meant, even if he saw it. Jacob quickly brought the letter outside to where Joseph and Running Deer were preparing to leave. "You need to see this." Joseph read the letter slowly, his weathered face showing a mixture of sadness and pride. When he finished, he held the paper carefully as if it were something sacred. Samuel knew. He knew what was coming and went anyway. He looked up at Jacob. He was a brave man. "My daughter chose well when she married him." "The marker," Jacob said. 3 interlocking circles. Ayesha's symbol. "Would you recognize it if you saw it?" "I would recognize it anywhere," Joseph said. "Ayesha carved it on everything she owned. It was her way of marking her presence, of saying, 'I was here, I mattered, I belonged.'" His voice grew thick with emotion. "Samuel used it after she died, as a way of honoring her memory. I saw it carved on trees near their favorite places, on stones where they had camped together." Running Deer spoke quietly. "If the marker is there, I can find it. I know what to look for now." They set out immediately, the morning sun just beginning to paint the eastern peaks with gold and rose. The temperature was well below freezing, and their breath misted in the air as they rode. Jacob led on his horse, with Running Deer and 2 other Salish warriors following. Sarah had wanted to come, but Jacob had convinced her to stay behind, arguing that they needed someone at the lodge who could raise the alarm if they didn't return. The journey to the old mining camp took 3 hours of careful travel. They stayed off the main trails, using game paths and natural cover to mask their approach. Twice they stopped when Running Deer spotted signs of recent passage, waiting until they were sure no one was nearby before continuing. As they drew within a mile of the camp, they left the horses tied in a sheltered ravine and continued on foot. Running Deer took the lead now, moving with the fluid silence of someone who'd grown up hunting these mountains. Jacob followed, impressed by the young man's skill and confidence. They reached a ridge overlooking the mining camp around mid-morning. From their vantage point, Jacob could see the layout clearly. There were 4 rough cabins, several equipment sheds, piles of mining debris, and what looked like the entrance to a played-out mine shaft. 6 men were visible, moving about their business. One was Moss, recognizable by his size and bearing. "There," Running Deer whispered, pointing to a rock formation about a quarter-mile beyond the camp. It did indeed look like an eye, a natural hollow in the cliff face with a distinctive overhang that created the impression of a brow. At the base of the formation, Jacob could see water glinting in the sunlight where a spring emerged. "Devil's Eye," Jacob murmured. "We call it Watching Stone," Running Deer corrected. "It is where the mountain observes what passes below. A sacred place, though the miners would not understand that. They studied the terrain, looking for the best approach. The formation was exposed, visible from the camp. Getting there without being seen would require either a distraction or perfect timing. "We wait," Jacob decided. "Watch their patterns. See when they're least attentive." They settled into position and observed. The men below followed a routine. Every 2 hours, 5 of them gathered near the largest cabin, apparently for a meal or break. That left only 1 man on watch, and he tended to focus on the main approach routes rather than the difficult terrain leading to the rock formation. Around noon, the pattern repeated. 5 men went inside, leaving a single guard. Jacob nodded to Running Deer. "Now!" They moved quickly but carefully, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. Jacob's heart pounded as they crossed the most exposed sections, knowing that a single alert guard could turn this into a disaster. But their luck held, and within 20 minutes they reached the base of the rock formation. The spring emerged from a crack in the rock face, forming a small pool before flowing downhill. The area around it showed signs of old reverence: stacked stones, faded paint marks, the remains of what might have been offerings. The miners had disturbed some of it, but the essential character of the place remained. "The marker," Running Deer said urgently. "We must find the marker." They searched the rock face systematically. It took nearly 10 minutes that felt like hours, before Jacob spotted it. About 8 feet up the cliff, carved into the stone with careful precision, were 3 interlocking circles, a Yasha's symbol, marking the place where something precious was hidden. "Here," Jacob said. Running Deer climbed up and examined the area around the carving. He pressed and probed at the rock, looking for any indication of a cavity or hidden space. Finally, his fingers found something. "There is a gap behind this stone." Working carefully, they managed to loosen a flat piece of rock that had been fitted so precisely into the cliff face that it appeared natural. Behind it was a small cavity, and inside that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth and leather, was a wooden box. Jacob lifted it out with trembling hands. The box was surprisingly heavy, carefully constructed and sealed with pitch to keep out moisture. This was it. This was what Samuel had died protecting, what Moss had murdered for without even knowing what it was. They were just starting down the cliff when they heard a shout from the mining camp. Someone had spotted them. "Run," Jacob said, but he knew it was futile. They were too exposed, too far from cover. Within seconds, men were pouring out of the cabins, and Moss's voice was bellowing orders. Jacob and Running Deer reached the ground and started toward the nearest cover, but they'd only gone a few yards when gunfire cracked across the distance. The shots were meant to warn, not to kill, at least not yet. Moss wanted them alive, wanted to know what they'd taken. Then, from the direction they'd come, there was more gunfire. But this was aimed at the camp, forcing Moss's men to take cover. Jacob looked back and saw the other 2 Salish warriors positioned on the ridge, providing covering fire. "Go!" one of them shouted. "We will hold them!" Jacob and Running Deer ran. The box clutched against Jacob's chest. Behind them, the firefight intensified. Moss's men were returning fire now, and Jacob knew the 2 warriors couldn't hold them long. They reached the first line of trees just as bullets began chewing up the ground around them. They were perhaps 200 yards from the camp when Jacob heard someone crashing through the brush behind them. He spun, rifle ready, and found himself facing not Moss's men, but a single figure he hadn't expected to see. Henry Blackwood stood there, disheveled and clearly exhausted, his clothes torn and dirty. He was unarmed, his hands raised. "Don't shoot," Henry gasped. "Please, I came to help. I came to make this right." Jacob kept his rifle aimed. "You're 5 years too late for that." "I know." Henry's face was ravaged by guilt and shame. "I know what I did. I led Moss to my father. I was weak, and my father died because of it. I've lived with that every day since." "Then why are you here now?" Jacob demanded. "Because I saw you heading this way. I've been watching, staying close, trying to find the courage to help, but always failing." Henry's voice broke. "But when I saw you go for the headdress, I knew this was my last chance. I can't bring my father back. I can't undo what I did. But I can help you get away. I can finally do one thing right." From the direction of the camp, Moss's voice roared. "Find them! I want that box!" Jacob had to make a decision instantly. Trust Henry or leave him? The rifleman in him said leave him, one more person to slow them down. But the part of him that understood guilt and redemption said differently. "Can you shoot?" Jacob asked. "Yes," Henry said. Jacob handed him a pistol from his belt. "Then help us get to the horses. That's how you make it right." They ran together, 3 men carrying the future of a people in a wooden box, pursued by 6 men who saw only profit and possession. The chase became a running firefight as they crashed through the forest. Jacob would stop, fire and move. Running Deer did the same from different positions, and Henry, to Jacob's surprise, held his ground when needed, buying them precious seconds. They reached the ravine where the horses waited just as Moss and his men closed to within 50 yards. Jacob secured the box in his saddlebag, while Running Deer and Henry laid down covering fire. Then they all mounted, Henry jumping up behind Jacob and spurred the horses into motion. The ride back to the lodge was desperate and hard. Moss pursued them for the first hour, but eventually fell back when it became clear he couldn't match their pace. By the time they reached the lodge, all 3 of them were exhausted, bruised, and shaking with adrenaline. Sarah ran out as they dismounted, her face showing relief and worry in equal measure. The other warriors fighting their way out, Running Deer said. They knew the risk. They accepted it. Joseph emerged from where he'd been waiting, his eyes immediately finding the box Jacob carried. You have it? Jacob handed it to the old man. Samuel kept his promise. The headdress is safe. Joseph took the box with reverence, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Jacob, then at Running Deer, and finally at Henry, who stood apart from the group, clearly uncertain of his welcome. My father's son, Joseph said to Henry, and the simple words held both acknowledgement and forgiveness. You came when it mattered. That counts for something. Henry's face crumpled and he fell to his knees. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I failed him. I failed everyone. Joseph placed one weathered hand on Henry's shoulder. Courage is not the absence of fear or weakness. It is the choice to act rightly despite them. Today you made that choice. Samuel would be proud of that, even if he grieved your earlier choices. As the sun set behind the western peaks, they gathered in the lodge. Jacob, Sarah, Joseph, Running Deer, Henry, and eventually the two other warriors who arrived an hour later, wounded but alive. Joseph carefully opened the box and removed the ceremonial headdress. It was magnificent. Eagle feathers arranged in perfect symmetry, intricate beadwork in traditional patterns, leather ties decorated with symbols that spoke of leadership and wisdom. It wasn't made of gold or adorned with jewels. Its value was in what it represented: continuity, heritage, the unbroken line between past leaders and future ones. Joseph held it with tears running down his weathered cheeks. My grandfather wore this, and his grandfather before him. We thought it lost forever. Samuel found it, protected it, and died to keep it safe. Now it returns to us. He looked around at the group assembled in the lodge. Each of you played a part in this. Each of you honored Samuel's memory and completed his mission. My people will know what you did. Your names will be remembered with respect and gratitude. Henry spoke quietly. I don't deserve... You earned your place here today, Joseph interrupted gently. You faced your failure and chose to make it right. That is all anyone can do. As night fell and they shared a meal, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A card game, a mysterious legacy, a grieving father-in-law, a guilty son, and a widow seeking purpose. All of them connected by Samuel's determination to honor the family he'd lost, by protecting the heritage they'd left behind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Moss wouldn't stop, and the headdress still needed to be formally returned to the Salish people. But tonight, in the lodge Samuel had built as a sanctuary, they had succeeded in completing the most important part of his mission. Jacob looked at the photograph of Samuel with Ayasha and Little Bird, still tucked in the shaving mirror frame. We did it, he said quietly, as if Samuel could hear him. Your promise is kept. Outside, the mountains stood silent and eternal, witnesses to everything that had transpired. Inside, a group of unlikely allies sat together, bound by shared purpose and mutual respect, having learned that some legacies are worth any risk to preserve. The evening after recovering the headdress, Jacob found Samuel's pocket watch lying on his pillow. He hadn't put it there. Someone had entered the lodge while they were gathered downstairs and left it as a message. The watch was beautiful, gold-cased, with intricate engraving, obviously valuable both materially and sentimentally. Jacob opened it and found an inscription inside. Time makes all things right, to Henry, with love from father. Jacob went downstairs where the others were still gathered. Henry, did you leave this? Henry looked up and his face went pale when he saw the watch. That's my father's watch. The one I gave him when I turned 18, but I haven't seen it since he died. Moss took it from his body. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Moss had been there when Samuel died. Moss had taken the watch as a trophy or proof. And now someone had taken it back and left it as a message for Jacob. Who could have gotten it, Sarah asked. Only someone close to Moss, old Tom said. He'd arrived an hour earlier with news from town. Someone in his camp or his confidence. Joseph examined the watch carefully. This is both a warning and a gift. Warning that Moss knows we have the headdress. Gift that someone in his camp may not be loyal to him. They spent the rest of the evening discussing what the watch meant and what would come next. Moss had pursued them from the mining camp but had lost the trail. He knew they'd taken something, but probably didn't know exactly what. The watch suggested he was still searching, still determined. "He won't stop," Running Deer said. "He has invested too much time, too much money, and now he has been humiliated by our success." "What will he do?" Sarah asked. Old Tom answered. "He'll come here, to the lodge. He knows this is where you'll bring whatever you found. He'll come with enough men to overwhelm any defense, and he'll tear this place apart, looking for what he thinks is valuable." "Then we need to be ready," Jacob said, "or we need to leave." "No," Joseph's voice was firm. "The headdress must be returned to my people with proper ceremony. That takes time, at least 3 days to prepare correctly, to gather the elders, to perform the necessary rituals. We cannot simply hand it over like a piece of trade goods. It must be done right to honor both the headdress itself and Samuel's sacrifice in protecting it." 3 days, Jacob said. "Can we hold this lodge against Moss for 3 days?" "We can try," Running Deer said. "My warriors and I will stay. We will help defend this place. And I'll spread word to the men I mentioned," Old Tom added. "There are at least 5 or 6 who'll stand with you against Moss. Good men, tired of seeing him push people around." Henry spoke up quietly. "I know Moss's methods. I know how he thinks. Let me help plan the defense." Jacob studied the group around him. A tribal elder and his warriors, an old trapper, a guilt-ridden son seeking redemption, and a postmistress who understood more about courage than most soldiers Jacob had known. It wasn't an army, but it was more than he'd ever expected to have standing beside him. "All right," Jacob said. "We defend the lodge for 3 days. We give Joseph the time he needs to return the headdress properly. And we make sure Moss doesn't get what Samuel died protecting." They worked through the night, planning and preparing. Henry, drawing on his knowledge of how his father had thought and how Moss operated, helped them understand the likely avenues of approach. Old Tom, with his decades of mountain experience, identified the best defensive positions. Running Deer and his warriors assessed the tactical situation with the practiced eye of men who'd defended territory before. Jacob took notes, creating a comprehensive plan that accounted for their limited numbers and the likelihood that Moss would bring overwhelming force. They couldn't win a straight fight. They had to be smarter, use the terrain, make Moss pay for every advantage he tried to take. By dawn, they had their strategy. The lodge itself would be the final defensive position, but they'd create layers before that. Tripwires in the forest approaches, early warning signals, prepared positions where a few defenders could slow many attackers. The goal wasn't to kill Moss's men, but to delay them, to make the cost of assault so high that Moss would have to reconsider. "He'll come at night," Henry predicted. "That's his style. He'll think darkness gives him advantage, lets him approach unseen. Then we prepare for night fighting," Jacob said. "Lanterns positioned to blind attackers, clear fields of fire, predetermined fallback positions we can reach in darkness." Sarah had been quiet during most of the planning, but now she spoke up. "What about the law?" "Sheriff Clayton said he'd help if there was violence. Clayton's 3 hours away at best," Old Tom said. "And Moss will make sure he has a story ready, that we're the aggressors, that he was defending his legal claim, that we attacked his men first. Unless we have a witness Clayton trusts, Moss will spin this his way." "Then we need a witness," Sarah said. "Someone who can testify to what really happens. Are you volunteering?" Jacob asked. "I am," she said firmly. "I'll write to Clayton before Moss arrives. I'll tell him what's coming and ask him to be here. If he can't come himself, at least there will be a record of our warning. And if violence happens, I'll be a credible witness that Moss initiated it." It was a good plan, but Jacob didn't like the danger it put Sarah in. "If you leave now, Moss might intercept you on the trail." "I know the back routes," she said. "Trails Moss doesn't know about. I can reach Clayton safely if I leave immediately." They discussed it for another hour, refining details and addressing problems. Finally, as the sun climbed toward midday, they had their complete strategy. Sarah would leave immediately for Clayton's office. Joseph and one warrior would depart with the headdress, taking it to the winter camp where the ceremony could be prepared. That left Jacob, Henry, Running Deer, and 2 warriors to defend the lodge, with old Tom and his recruits arriving over the next day or 2. Joseph approached Jacob before leaving. "I want you to have this," he said, holding out a ceremonial knife in a beaded sheath. "It belonged to Ayasha's grandfather, a great warrior and leader. Samuel carried it sometimes, said it gave him courage when he needed it most. Now I give it to you, guardian of Samuel's lodge, protector of my people's heritage." Jacob accepted the knife with gratitude and respect. "I'll do everything I can to protect what Samuel built here." "You already have," Joseph said. "By caring when you had no obligation to care. By standing when you could have walked away. By honoring promises made by a man you never met to people you never knew." He placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Samuel chose well when fate brought you to that card game. And I choose well now, entrusting you with this final task." After Joseph left with the headdress, the lodge felt emptier but also more focused. Those who remained had one job: hold this ground for 3 days. Give Joseph time to complete the ceremony. Ensure Samuel's 20-year mission ended in success rather than failure. They spent the afternoon implementing their defensive preparations. Running Deer and his warriors, moving with practiced efficiency, set tripwires and early warning devices in the forest approaches. Henry, channeling guilt into useful work, reinforced the lodge's doors and windows, creating firing positions and escape routes. Old Tom returned with 2 recruits, hard-eyed men who'd seen their share of trouble and didn't shy from more. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and crimson, Jacob stood on the porch and surveyed their preparations. It wasn't much, not really. A handful of defenders against Moss's resources, but it was something. And sometimes something was enough. Sarah approached, dressed for travel and carrying supplies for the ride to Clayton's office. "I'll be back as soon as I can. Tomorrow evening at the latest? If I don't return by then, you'll return," Jacob interrupted. "You're too stubborn not to," she smiled slightly. "I learned that from you, I think. Or maybe from Samuel's example. Strange how a dead man can still teach the living about courage?" "Not so strange," Jacob said. "Good men leave lessons behind. It's what makes them worth remembering." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "When this is over, when the headdress is returned and Moss is dealt with, what will you do?" "I haven't thought that far ahead," Jacob admitted. "Maybe you should. Maybe it's time to think about living instead of just surviving." She touched his arm briefly, a gesture of concern and something more. "The lodge needs someone to care for it. Someone who understands what Samuel was doing and why it mattered. I think you're that person." Before Jacob could respond, she mounted her horse and rode off into the gathering darkness, taking the back trail that would lead her safely around Moss's likely positions. Jacob watched until she disappeared into the trees, then went back inside where the others were preparing the evening meal. Henry was at the stove, cooking salt pork and beans with surprising competence. "Learned to cook when I was drifting," he explained, when he saw Jacob's expression. "Couldn't always afford to eat in town." They ate together, this unlikely band of defenders, and Jacob was struck by the normalcy of it. Men sharing a meal before facing danger wasn't new to him. He'd done it countless times during his army years. But this felt different. These men weren't just soldiers following orders. They were here by choice, defending something they believed mattered. After the meal, as they were cleaning up, Running Deer spoke. "Tell me about your war, Jacob Stone. What did you fight for?" Jacob thought about how to answer. "We said we fought to preserve the Union, to end slavery." And that was true. But when you're actually in it, when you're scouting ahead of the army or tracking hostile forces, you fight for simpler reasons. You fight for the men beside you. You fight to survive. You fight because not fighting means failing the people who depend on you. That is the only fighting worth doing, Running Deer said. Fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. Fighting to protect rather than to take. My grandfather taught me this, and Samuel lived this truth. Henry cleared his throat. I never understood that about my father. He had education opportunities. He could have made money, built a comfortable life in a city. Instead, he came here, married into a tribe most settlers despised, and spent his life protecting artifacts most people would sell for pocket money. He looked down at his hands. I used to think he was crazy. Now I think he was the sanest man I ever knew. He found what mattered to him, Jacob said. That's more than most men ever do. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and building the kind of trust that comes from facing danger together. Old Tom told tales from his decades in the mountains, stories that made them laugh despite the tension. Running Deer spoke of his grandfather's teachings about honor and responsibility. Henry, hesitantly at first, but then with growing confidence, shared memories of Samuel, the patient way he'd taught Henry to track animals, the quiet pride when Henry learned to read, the sadness that never quite left his eyes after Ayasha and Little Bird died. Around midnight, they finally settled in for rest. They'd arranged a watch schedule, 2 men awake at all times, positioned where they could see the approaches and sound an alarm if needed. Jacob took the first watch with one of Running Deer's warriors, a quiet man named Swift Fox, who communicated more through gestures than words. The night was cold and clear, the stars brilliant overhead. Jacob walked the perimeter they'd established, checking their preparations and listening to the forest sounds. Everything seemed normal, the wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that somewhere out there in the darkness, Moss was planning his move. Around 2 in the morning, Swift Fox made a hand signal. He'd heard something. Jacob moved to his position and listened. There, the faint sound of a horse, distant but approaching. They waited, weapons ready, as the sound grew closer. A single rider emerged from the trees, hands raised and visible. In the moonlight, Jacob recognized the figure. It was one of Moss's men, but not one of the hardened fighters. This was Jimmy Coulter, a young man who worked in Moss's mining operation, barely 20 years old. "Don't shoot," Jimmy called out. "I came to warn you." Jacob kept his rifle trained, but gestured for the boy to approach. "Warning about what?" Jimmy dismounted carefully, keeping his hands visible. "Moss is coming. Tomorrow night. He's got 12 men, all armed. He plans to surround the lodge and force you out. He says you stole something from his claim, says he has a right to search the property. Why are you telling us this?" Jacob asked. "Because what you're doing is right," Jimmy said. "I heard some of the talk. I know Samuel Blackwood wasn't a thief, and I know Moss killed him. I can't prove it, but I was there when Moss came back that night 5 years ago, and I saw the look on his face. I saw him put that watch in his pocket." The young man's voice shook. "I've stayed quiet too long. I can't do it anymore." Jacob studied him, trying to gauge sincerity. The boy seemed genuinely frightened, but also determined. "If Moss finds out you came here, then I'll deal with it," Jimmy said. "But at least I'll have done one thing right. At least I'll have helped stop him before he kills someone else." Jacob made a decision. "Come inside. Tell us everything you know about his plan." They woke the others, and Jimmy detailed Moss's strategy. 12 men would approach from 3 directions, surrounding the lodge by midnight tomorrow. They'd demand Jacob surrender whatever he'd taken from the mining camp. If he refused, they'd set fire to the outbuildings and force everyone out. Moss wanted the lodge and its contents intact if possible, but he was willing to burn it if necessary. "He's hired men from outside the territory," Jimmy added. "Rough types who won't ask questions or show mercy. Your only advantage is that half his regular crew refused to join him. They didn't sign on to fight honest men over something that belongs to the tribes anyway." "You said half refused," Running Deer observed. "That means half agreed. 6 of them," Jimmy confirmed. "Plus Moss and the 5 outsiders he hired. 12 total, like I said." Old Tom whistled low. 12 against 6 of us. Those are hard odds. "We've got defensive position," Jacob countered. "We've got preparation. And we've got right on our side. Right doesn't stop bullets," Old Tom said, but he was grinning. "But it helps a man aim straight, I've noticed. They refined their plans based on Jimmy's intelligence, adjusting their defensive positions to account for the three-pronged approach Moss planned. Jacob was grateful for the warning. It might make the difference between surviving and being overwhelmed. As dawn broke, Jimmy prepared to leave. "I'll ride to the sheriff myself," he said. "Tell him what's happening. Maybe between me and Miss Brennan, Clayton will have to act." "That's dangerous for you," Jacob said. "No more dangerous than what you're doing," Jimmy replied. "Besides, my pa didn't raise me to stand by while wrong happens. He'd be ashamed if I did." After Jimmy left, the defenders spent the day making final preparations. They positioned water barrels in case of fire, created covered positions for the shooters, and established clear lines of retreat if they were forced back. Henry proved surprisingly useful, his guilt-driven energy channeling into practical improvements to their defenses. Around noon, Old Tom's remaining recruits arrived, 3 more men, making their total force 9 defenders. It wasn't much against 12 attackers, but it was better than 6. And one of the newcomers, a grizzled former soldier named Pike, brought experience with defensive tactics that supplemented Jacob's planning. "Fought in the war," Pike explained. "Learned how to make a few men look like many, how to make attackers think twice about pressing an assault. If Moss wants this lodge, he's going to pay for every inch." They drilled throughout the afternoon, practicing their positions and fallback sequences. Running Deer's warriors demonstrated traditional tactics that complemented the more conventional military approach. By evening, they had transformed the lodge and its surroundings into a defensible position that would make any attack costly. As the sun set on their second day of preparation, Jacob gathered everyone together. "Tomorrow night Moss comes. He'll have numbers and weapons, but we have something better. We have purpose. We know what we're defending and why it matters. Samuel gave his life for this. Joseph trusted us with his people's most sacred possession. We're not fighting for property or profit. We're fighting for honor, for protection of what deserves protecting." He paused, looking at each face, Henry struggling with his past, Old Tom standing despite his age, Running Deer and his warriors committed to their people's heritage, Pike and the others choosing right over easy. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you're standing for something that matters. That's more than most men can say about their fights. Speeches are nice," Old Tom said with a slight smile. "But I'd feel better if Miss Brennan got back with the sheriff." As if summoned by his words, they heard a horse approaching fast. Jacob and the others grabbed weapons and took positions, then relaxed when they recognized Sarah's gray mare. She rode in hard, dismounting before the horse fully stopped. "Clayton's coming," she gasped, out of breath. "He left an hour behind me with 3 deputies. Jimmy Coulter reached him this morning, told him everything. Clayton says if Moss attacks, he'll arrest him for assault and attempted murder. But he has to witness it or have credible witnesses. When will he get here?" Jacob asked. "Dawn tomorrow if they ride through the night. Maybe noon if they rest." Sarah looked exhausted but determined. "I told him to hurry. Told him Moss plans to attack tomorrow night. Then we need to delay Moss if he comes before Clayton arrives," Jacob said. He looked at the others. "Everyone understand? We defend, we delay, but we don't attack unless forced. We want Moss to be clearly the aggressor when Clayton witnesses this." They agreed, and the final preparations continued into the night. Sarah refused to leave despite Jacob's urging, insisting she needed to be there as a witness. Henry quietly positioned himself near the lodge's main entrance, saying that if anyone should face Moss first, it should be the man who'd failed to face him 5 years earlier. Around midnight, as Jacob was checking the perimeter one final time, he found Henry sitting alone on the porch, holding Samuel's watch. "He gave me this when I turned 18, Henry said quietly. "Told me it meant I was a man now, that I had to start making my own choices and living with them." He opened the watch and looked at the inscription. "I've made a lot of wrong choices since then. Tomorrow's my chance to make a right one." "You already made it," Jacob said. "When you came to help us at the mining camp. When you stood up to be counted, that was one choice. Tomorrow might require another." Henry closed the watch. "If Moss gets through, if things go badly, promise me something." Promise me you'll make sure Joseph knows I tried to make things right, that I finally found the courage my father deserved from me." "You can tell him yourself," Jacob said. "When this is over." Henry smiled sadly. "Maybe, but if I can't promise me." "I promise," Jacob said. They sat together in the cold darkness, two men who'd spent years running from their pasts, now preparing to face a future that might cost them everything. The watch ticked steadily in Henry's hands, marking time that was running out. Tomorrow would test them all, would determine whether Samuel's sacrifice and Joseph's trust had been placed wisely. Jacob thought about Mary and his daughter, about how grief had driven him into the mountains and kept him there for 15 years. He thought about Samuel and Ayasha, about Joseph and little Bird, about all the people whose losses had led to this moment. Life was strange that way, how death and grief could eventually lead back to purpose and connection if a man was willing to let it. The night deepened and the temperature dropped. Jacob added more wood to the fire inside, checked weapons one more time, and finally settled in for a few hours of rest before dawn. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it either vindication or disaster, but they were as ready as they could be. In the darkness, the lodge stood silent and strong, built by a man who'd understood that some things were worth defending. Now it would either stand as his monument or burn as his pyre. Either way, Samuel's legacy would endure in the headdress that was even now being prepared for ceremony, in the artifacts he'd protected, in the lives he'd touched through his quiet dedication. Jacob fell asleep, thinking about what Sarah had asked him. What would he do when this was over? For the first time in 15 years, he had an answer. He would stay. He would maintain the lodge as Samuel had intended. He would continue the work of protection and preservation. He would stop running from life and start living it again, if he survived tomorrow to make that choice. The morning after the fight brought a strange quiet to the lodge. Clayton and his deputies had taken Moss's men into custody, binding them and securing them in the damaged stable under guard. The hired guns who'd fled had been tracked down by First Light, found hiding in a ravine 3 miles away, cold and frightened and eager to surrender. Sarah had worked through the night on Henry and Moss, both men clinging to life by threads. Henry had regained consciousness around dawn, weak but lucid enough to smile when Jacob told him they'd won, that the lodge still stood, that his father's legacy was protected. Moss remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Sarah did what she could, but the bullet had done significant damage. Whether he lived or died now was beyond anyone's control but his own and Providence. Jacob stood on the porch, looking out at the damage. The stable's roof was partially burned. The lodge walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The ground was torn up from the fighting, marked with blood in places. But the structure stood solid, just as Samuel had built it, just as it had sheltered him for 20 years. Old Tom approached, moving stiffly from his own minor wounds. "We're all still here," he observed. "That's better than I expected when I saw 12 men coming at us." "We had good preparation," Jacob said. "And good people standing together, and a good cause," Tom added. "That matters more than people think. Men fight harder when they know what they're protecting is worth it." Running Deer joined them, his face somber. "We have prepared Little Wolf for burial. He died protecting what was sacred. He will be honored by our people." "He saved my life," Jacob said. "When Henry was hit, when I went back for him, Little Wolf kept Moss's men from cutting me down. I owe him everything." "He did what warriors do," Running Deer said simply. "He stood for what mattered. That is the best death a man can have." They buried Little Wolf on the ridge overlooking the lodge, in a place with a clear view of the mountains to the west. Joseph had sent word that the warrior should be honored in the traditional way, and Running Deer performed the ceremony with dignity and respect. Even Clayton and his deputies stood witness, hats in hands, acknowledging the sacrifice that had been made. After the burial, Clayton gathered everyone together. "I need statements from each of you about what happened here. Moss and his men will face charges: assault, attempted murder, arson, and possibly murder in Samuel Blackwood's death, if I can build that case with Jimmy Coulter's testimony." "What about us?" Jacob asked. We killed at least one of Moss's men, wounded others. Self-defense, witnessed by me and my deputies, Clayton said firmly. You did everything right. Held your fire until attacked, tried to avoid violence, defended yourselves proportionally. No charges against any of you. He paused. In fact, I'm recommending commendations for all of you. You defended your property against an illegal attack. That takes courage. They spent the rest of the morning giving statements and helping Clayton document the scene. Jimmy Coulter arrived around noon, nervous but determined to testify about what he'd witnessed 5 years ago. With his testimony and the physical evidence from last night's attack, Clayton was confident he could build a strong case against Moss. Around 2 o'clock, Sarah emerged from the lodge where she'd been tending the wounded. Henry's asking for you, Jacob, and Joseph has arrived. He heard about the fight and came as quickly as he could. Jacob went inside and found Henry propped up in bed, pale but alert. Joseph sat beside him, one weathered hand resting on Henry's shoulder. The old man looked at Jacob with an expression of profound gratitude and respect. You held the lodge, Joseph said. You protected what Samuel died for. You honored his memory and completed his work. We all did, Jacob said. Henry saved the stable. Little Wolf gave his life. Everyone here stood together, as it should be, Joseph said. Samuel would be proud. Of all of you, he looked at Henry, and of his son, who found courage when it mattered most. Henry's eyes were wet. I waited too long. Cost too much. You acted when you could, Joseph said gently. That is what matters. The past cannot be changed, but you chose to make the present right. Samuel understood such choices. He made many himself. Joseph reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The ceremony was completed this morning. The headdress has been returned to its rightful place among my people. The elders wept when they saw it, when they understood what Samuel had done to protect it all these years. He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a smaller item, a leather armband decorated with intricate beadwork. This belonged to Ayesha. She made it herself, wore it always. I want you to have it, Jacob Stone, as a symbol of the bond between us and as thanks for what you have done. Jacob accepted the armband with reverence. The beadwork was beautiful, clearly made with love and skill. I'm honored, but I didn't do this alone. We know, Joseph interrupted, and each person who helped will receive recognition from my people. But you are the one who chose to stay when you could have left. You are the one who inherited Samuel's mission and made it your own. You are the one who made this lodge what Samuel intended it to be, a sanctuary that protects what should be protected. Jacob secured the armband around his wrist, feeling the weight of the gesture and the responsibility it represented. He'd come to these mountains seeking isolation and found instead a community, a purpose, and a legacy that connected him to people both living and dead. Clayton appeared in the doorway. Jacob, you should know, Moss just woke up. He's asking to speak with you. Jacob found Moss in the other room, propped up and looking grey with pain and fever. The man who'd been so confident and threatening now looked diminished, mortal, facing his own fragility. Stone, Moss said, his voice weak. I need to say something. Jacob waited, not offering comfort or condemnation, just listening. I was wrong, Moss said. About the headdress, about Samuel, about all of it. I thought I was pursuing something valuable. Instead, I destroyed something that mattered. He coughed, wincing at the pain. Samuel tried to tell me, tried to make me understand. But I only saw profit, only saw what I could take from these mountains, rather than what they were trying to teach me. Why are you telling me this? Jacob asked. Because I'm probably dying, and I don't want to die with lies on my conscience. Moss looked at him directly. I did push Samuel. We argued about the headdress. He refused to tell me where it was, said it belonged to the Salish people, that I had no right to it. He got angry, shoved him, he fell. I told myself it was an accident, but the truth is, I could have helped him and didn't. I watched him die, and then took what I could from his body and left him there. The confession hung in the air, like smoke. Clayton, standing nearby, had heard every word. That's murder, Moss, or at minimum manslaughter and failure to render aid. I know, Moss said. And I'll answer for it if I live. He looked back at Jacob. But I wanted you to know the truth. Wanted Henry to know that his father died defending what mattered to him, that he didn't compromise or surrender. Samuel Blackwood was a better man than I'll ever be. Jacob felt a strange mixture of emotions, anger at what Moss had done, pity for what he'd become, and something like respect for this final honesty. Henry will need to hear this from you directly. He's carried guilt for 5 years, thinking his weakness led to his father's death. It did, Moss said quietly. But my cruelty finished it. We're both guilty, him and me. But at least he tried to make it right. That's more than I did until now. Later, after Moss had given his confession to Henry and received what passed for forgiveness from a man who understood guilt too well, Jacob stood outside watching the sun set behind the western peaks. Sarah joined him, moving close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "It's over," she said. "Really over." The headdress returned, Moss confessed. Henry redeemed. "Everything Samuel worked for has been completed." "Almost everything," Jacob said. "There are still other caches Samuel created. Other artifacts that need to be protected or returned. The work isn't finished. Will you finish it?" Sarah asked. Jacob thought about the question, about the lodge and the mountains, and the legacy he'd inherited. He thought about Samuel and Ayasha, about Joseph and Little Wolf, about Henry's redemption and his own journey from isolation to connection. "Yes," he said, "I'll finish it. This is my home now, my purpose. Samuel started something important, and I'm going to see it through." Sarah smiled. "Good, because I've decided to help you. Someone needs to keep documenting what Samuel started, needs to work with Joseph's people and the territorial authorities to protect other sites. And I'm tired of town anyway. Too many people asking questions, not enough people doing what matters." "You'd leave the post office?" Jacob asked, surprised. "Already did. Gave notice yesterday, before the fight. I figured either we'd win and I'd have new work to do, or we'd lose and it wouldn't matter anyway." She looked at him directly. "I'm staying here, Jacob, at the lodge. If you'll have me as a partner in this work." Jacob felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen for 15 years, beginning to thaw. "I'd be honored and grateful. This is too big for one person anyway." They stood together as the last light faded from the sky. Two people who'd found purpose in protecting a dead man's legacy, who'd discovered that isolation wasn't strength, but connection was. The lodge behind them stood strong despite its scars, a testament to what could be built and defended when people cared enough to try. Inside, Henry was recovering under Joseph's watchful care. Moss was beginning the long process of answering for his crimes. Clayton was preparing to transport his prisoners to face territorial justice. Old Tom and the others who'd stood with them were sharing stories and building friendships forged in fire. Jacob looked at the armband on his wrist, at the intricate beadwork Ayasha had created decades ago. He thought about how love and loss could drive a person into the mountains, and how purpose and connection could bring them back out again. Samuel had learned that lesson. Now Jacob was learning it too. "Tomorrow we start repairs," Jacob said. "Fix the stable, patch the bullet holes, make the lodge whole again." "And the day after that?" Sarah asked. "The day after that we start mapping the other cache locations. We finish what Samuel started properly and thoroughly. We work with Joseph's people to return what belongs to them and protect what needs protecting." He paused. "And we build something new here, something that honors the past while looking toward the future." Sarah's hand found his in the darkness, warm and certain. "That sounds like a good plan. A good life." Jacob squeezed her hand gently, accepting the gift of connection after so many years of refusing it. "It does. Samuel would approve, I think. He built this lodge as a sanctuary. Now it becomes something more, a place where the past is honored and the future is protected." The stars emerged overhead, brilliant points of light in the vast darkness. Somewhere among them, Jacob liked to imagine, Samuel and Ayasha watched and approved. The work they'd started would continue. The legacy they'd built would endure. And the lodge they'd loved would stand as a monument to the truth that some things, honor, heritage, love, and purpose, were worth any sacrifice to preserve. 3 weeks after the fight, Jacob stood on the lodge porch and watched the first real signs of spring arrive in the mountains. The snow was melting from the southern slopes, exposing dark earth and the first green shoots of new growth. The air carried warmth for the first time in months, and birds Jacob hadn't seen all winter were returning to nest in the surrounding forest. The lodge had been repaired. The stable roof was rebuilt, stronger than before. The bullet holes in the walls had been patched, and the windows replaced. Old Tom and Pike had stayed on to help with the work, and their labor had transformed the damage from the fight into barely visible scars. The lodge stood solid and whole, ready for whatever came next. Henry had recovered enough to travel, though he moved carefully and tired easily. He'd chosen to stay in the territory rather than flee, as he'd done before, taking a room in town and working odd jobs to support himself. But he visited the lodge regularly, helping where he could and slowly building a relationship with Joseph that honored the grandfather-grandson connection that should have existed all along. Moss had survived his wounds, but faced a long list of charges. Clayton had built an airtight case with testimony from Jimmy Coulter, Henry, and the captured men who'd participated in the attack. The territorial judge had reviewed the evidence and ordered Moss held for trial on charges of manslaughter in Samuel's death, assault, attempted murder, and arson. Even with his connections, Moss would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Jacob had visited him once before the transfer to the territorial prison. Moss had looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his crimes and failures. But he'd also looked clearer, as if confession had freed something in him that greed and ambition had imprisoned. "I wasted my life chasing the wrong things," Moss had said. Samuel knew what mattered. "I never learned that lesson, not until it was too late." Jacob hadn't offered forgiveness or condemnation. Some things were beyond his authority to judge. But he'd acknowledged Moss's final honesty and wished him whatever peace he could find in the years ahead. Then he'd walked away, leaving that chapter closed. Now, standing in the warmth of early spring, Jacob reflected on how much had changed in the 3 months since he'd won the lodge in that card game. He'd arrived seeking isolation and found community. He'd expected solitude and discovered purpose. He'd thought he was hiding from life and instead had learned to live again. Sarah emerged from the lodge carrying 2 cups of coffee. She'd moved in officially a week ago, taking the smaller bedroom and establishing herself as full partner in the work of continuing Samuel's mission. She handed Jacob one of the cups and stood beside him looking out at the mountains with the same appreciation he felt. "Joseph sent word," she said. "He's coming tomorrow with a group from the winter camp. They want to thank us formally and discuss the other cache locations Samuel created." "How many people?" Jacob asked. 20 or so, elders and younger people both. "They're bringing gifts and want to perform a ceremony to honor Samuel's memory and recognize what we did." She smiled slightly. "I think we're going to need to build a larger meeting space if this kind of thing becomes regular." "It should become regular," Jacob said. "Samuel worked alone too much, kept everything too secret. If we're going to continue his mission properly, we need to work openly with Joseph's people. Let them guide us on what matters and how to protect it." "I agree," Sarah said. "I've been thinking about that. What if we formally established this place as more than just a lodge? What if we made it a center for preservation and protection? A place where artifacts could be temporarily stored before being returned, where records could be kept, where tribal elders and territorial authorities could work together." Jacob considered the idea. That would require formal recognition, probably territorial approval. Clayton says he'd support it. And Joseph has influence with both his people and sympathetic officials in the territorial government. If we approach it right, we could create something that protects not just what Samuel found, but sites and artifacts threatened throughout the territory. It was an ambitious vision, but Jacob found himself drawn to it. Samuel had worked in secret because he'd had no choice, because the times and circumstances had forced him into shadows. But times were changing slowly. Not everyone saw native heritage as something to be destroyed or stolen. Some people, like Clayton and the territorial officials Sarah mentioned, understood that preservation mattered, that history had value beyond profit. Let's propose it to Joseph tomorrow, Jacob decided. See what he thinks. If he supports it, we'll make it happen. They stood together in comfortable silence, drinking their coffee and watching the mountains come alive with spring. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals up from the valley. In the distance, Jacob could hear the creek that ran past the lodge, its flow increasing as snowmelt fed it from higher elevations. Old Tom appeared around the corner of the lodge, leading his horse. "I'm heading back to my place," he announced. "Been here long enough, getting soft with all this comfortable living." "You're welcome any time," Jacob said. "And we'll need your help as we locate the other caches." "Just send word," Tom said, mounting his horse with surprising agility for a man his age. "I'll come running, or hobbling more likely, but I'll come." He looked at them both, his weathered face creasing in a grin. "You two look good together, like you belong here." "Samuel would be pleased, I think. He always said the mountains send what you need when you need it." After Tom rode off, Sarah turned to Jacob. "Do we look good together?" "We look like partners," Jacob said carefully. "Like people working toward the same goal. Is that all we are?" Sarah asked, her tone light but her eyes serious. Jacob thought about how to answer. He'd spent 15 years shutting himself off from connection, from the risk of loss that came with caring about someone. But Sarah had shown him that isolation wasn't protection. It was just another form of dying slowly. "No," he said finally, "that's not all we are. Or at least, it's not all I want us to be." Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that lit up her whole face. "Good, because I didn't move all the way out here just to be your business partner." They stood close together, not quite touching, but close enough that Jacob could feel the warmth of her presence. It wasn't the passionate love of youth. They were both too weathered and experienced for that. But it was something deeper and more lasting. The steady companionship of people who'd faced hardship together and chosen to keep facing it side by side. The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Jacob looked up and saw Joseph riding in with running deer and 2 other warriors. They'd come a day early, and Joseph's expression suggested important news. "Jacob Stone, Sarah Brennan," Joseph said formally as he dismounted. "We bring news from the Territorial Council. They have agreed to recognize this lodge and the surrounding land as a cultural preservation site under joint management of the Salish people and the territorial government. You have been named as guardians, responsible for maintaining the property and continuing Samuel's work." Jacob felt his breath catch. "That's faster than I expected." "The story of the headdress and what happened here has spread," Joseph explained. "People are talking about Samuel's sacrifice and your courage in protecting what he died for. The territorial governor sees value in supporting preservation rather than just exploitation. It's a small step, but it is something. What does this mean practically?" Sarah asked. "It means this lodge is now officially protected," Running Deer said. "No mining claims can be filed here, no settlement without approval. And you have authority to work with us in identifying and protecting other sites throughout the territory." Joseph pulled out a document, official and sealed. "This is your appointment as cultural preservation guardians. It comes with a small salary from the territorial government and legal authority to access and protect historical sites. It also comes with great responsibility." Jacob accepted the document, reading through the formal language that essentially made him and Sarah official protectors of native heritage. It was more than he'd imagined possible 3 months ago when he'd first arrived at the lodge, seeking only isolation. "We accept," Jacob said, looking at Sarah for confirmation. She nodded firmly. "We'll honor Samuel's work and expand it. We'll do this right." "I know you will," Joseph said. "That is why my people supported this appointment. You have proven yourselves worthy of trust." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a new journal, its leather cover decorated with traditional designs. "This is for you, to record what comes next, as Samuel recorded what came before. The work continues, but now it continues with proper support and recognition." Jacob accepted the journal with reverence. He thought about Samuel's journals hidden in the desk, about the careful way a lonely man had documented 20 years of patient work. Now Jacob would continue that documentation, but with partners and support Samuel had never enjoyed. "There's something else," Joseph said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "The ceremony tomorrow, it is not just to thank you. It is to adopt you officially into our people. Both of you. You will be recognized as family, as Samuel was family, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." Jacob looked at Sarah, saw the emotion in her eyes that probably mirrored his own. To be adopted into the Salish people, to be given that honor and trust, was more than either of them had expected or felt they deserved. "We're honored," Sarah said, her voice thick with feeling. "Deeply honored. You have earned it," Joseph said simply. "Through courage, through sacrifice, through respect for what we hold sacred. Tomorrow we make it official, but in our hearts. You have been family since the moment you stood and fought for what Samuel protected." That evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and crimson, Jacob sat at Samuel's desk, his desk now, and opened the new journal Joseph had given him. He thought for a long time about what to write, how to begin this new chapter of the work Samuel had started. Finally, he put pen to paper and began. "My name is Jacob Stone, and this is the continuation of a mission that began long before I arrived in these mountains. Samuel Blackwood, a man I never met but whose legacy I now carry, spent 20 years protecting what others would destroy. He did this for love, for honor, for the memory of a wife and daughter taken too soon. He died defending what mattered most to him, and in dying, he passed his work to others who would carry it forward. 3 months ago, I won this lodge in a card game and thought I was simply acquiring property. Instead, I inherited purpose, discovered community, and learned that isolation isn't strength, but connection is. Together with Sarah Brennan, Joseph Three Horses, and many others, we have completed Samuel's most important work, returning the sacred headdress to its people. But there is more to do, more sites to protect, more heritage to preserve. This journal will record that work, so that those who come after us will know what was done and why it mattered. Samuel once wrote that a man can spend years running from his past, or one moment turning toward his future. I spent 15 years running. Now I stand still, rooted in this place, connected to this work, committed to honoring those who came before, while protecting what remains for those who come after. This is my promise, my purpose, my life's work now, and I am grateful beyond words to have found it." Jacob set down the pen and looked around the lodge, at the repaired walls, at Sarah preparing the evening meal, at the mountains visible through the windows, standing eternal and patient. He thought about Mary and his unnamed daughter, about how grief had driven him here, and how healing had found him despite his attempts to hide from it. Samuel's photograph still sat in the shaving mirror frame. Samuel, Ayasha, and little bird, frozen in a moment of happiness before tragedy took them. Jacob understood that photograph now, understood what it represented. Love didn't end with death. Purpose could transcend loss. And sometimes the greatest honor you could give those you'd lost was to live fully, to care deeply, to protect what mattered even at personal cost. Tomorrow would bring the adoption ceremony, would formally bind him to Joseph's people and their heritage. The day after that would bring new work, new challenges, new opportunities to continue what Samuel had started. But tonight, Jacob simply sat in the warmth of the lodge, grateful for the journey that had brought him here, grateful for the people who'd stood beside him, grateful for the purpose that had found him when he'd stopped running long enough to be found. Outside, the mountains stood silent under the emerging stars. Inside, the lodge was warm with firelight and companionship and the quiet satisfaction of work done well. Jacob had come seeking isolation and found home. He'd thought he wanted to hide from life and instead had learned to embrace it. He'd believed his story ended with loss and discovered it was only beginning. Samuel Blackwood had built this lodge as a sanctuary. Jacob Stone would maintain it as one, but also as something more, as a testament to the truth that healing comes through purpose, that redemption comes through action, and that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to protect what they loved for those who will come after. The fire burned steady and bright, warming the lodge against the mountain cold. Jacob closed the journal, content with his beginning, and joined Sarah by the hearth. Tomorrow would bring its ceremonies and challenges, but tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Jacob Stone was home.